Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Waipio Valley on Hawaii's Big Island, a place locals call the Valley of the Kings. Though, after what I experienced there, I think it deserves a darker name. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my girlfriend Sarah Rodriguez and our 2 college friends, Jennifer Brown and David Jones. We'd all just graduated and landed decent jobs in Honolulu, so this was meant to be our celebration before we got too caught up in adult responsibilities. Sarah had found the spot online, a secluded camping area deep in Waipio Valley, accessible only by a brutal hike down the cliff face and then several miles inland through dense tropical forest. "It'll be like we're the only people in the world," Sarah had said, her dark eyes sparkling with excitement as she showed us the satellite photos on her laptop. The images revealed a lush green valley floor bisected by a winding river, surrounded by towering cliffs that rose nearly 2,000 feet on all sides. It looked like paradise. We should have listened to the old Hawaiian man at the equipment rental shop in Waimea. As David loaded our packs with camping gear, the weathered local had approached us with obvious concern etched across his deeply lined face. "You kids planning to camp in Waipio?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lived on the island his entire life. "Yeah, we found this amazing spot deep in the valley," Jennifer replied cheerfully, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the shop's windows. The man's expression darkened. "There are places in that valley where the old spirits still walk, places where the night marchers roam. You should stick to the beach camping areas, where there are other people." David laughed it off. "Come on, man. We're not tourists. We live here now. We know how to handle ourselves in the wilderness." But the old man wasn't smiling. He looked directly at me with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "The valley remembers everything, young man. Every battle fought there, every life taken. Some places are better left undisturbed." I felt a chill run down my spine, but the others were already heading for the door, eager to begin our adventure. I mumbled a quick thank you to the man and followed my friends, pushing his warnings to the back of my mind. The hike down into Waipio Valley was treacherous, a narrow, rocky path that switchbacked down the cliff face with drops that would kill you instantly if you slipped. Sarah, who was afraid of heights, gripped my hand so tightly her nails left marks. But we made it down safely as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The valley floor was even more beautiful than the photos had suggested. Massive koa and ohia trees formed a dense canopy overhead, their branches draped with flowering vines that filled the air with an almost narcotic sweetness. The sound of rushing water echoed from somewhere ahead, the Hi'ilau Falls, which plunged nearly 1,500 feet from the valley's rim into a pool we couldn't yet see. We followed what appeared to be an old hunting trail deeper into the valley, away from the more accessible camping spots near the beach. After hiking for nearly 2 hours through increasingly thick vegetation, we found the perfect clearing. A circular space about 50 feet across, carpeted with soft grass and surrounded by towering trees. A small stream ran along one edge, providing fresh water. "This is perfect," Sarah breathed, dropping her pack and spinning around with her arms outstretched. "It's like our own private Eden." As we set up camp, I noticed several things that should have concerned me more than they did. First, the clearing was almost too perfect. The grass was too uniform, too well maintained for a natural space in the middle of untouched wilderness. Second, while the forest around us was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, our clearing was strangely quiet. And third, there were no signs that any animals had ever entered this space. No droppings. No tracks, no evidence of the wild boars that were supposed to be common in the valley. But we were tired, happy, and focused on enjoying our first night of freedom. We cooked dinner over a small camp stove, not wanting to risk a fire in the dry grass, and spent the evening talking and laughing as the first stars appeared through gaps in the canopy above. That's when we first heard the drums. It started as a low, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. At first, I thought it might be my heartbeat, but as the sound grew stronger, we all looked at each other with growing unease. "What is that?" Jennifer whispered, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching fear. David, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "Probably just water dripping somewhere, echoing through a cave system. These valleys are riddled with lava tubes." But the sound wasn't random. It had a deliberate pattern, like a slow, funereal march. Boom, 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 with occasional variations that almost sounded like a complex rhythm being played by multiple drummers. "Guys," Sarah said quietly, "my phone's acting weird." I checked mine and found the same thing. No signal, which wasn't surprising given our location. But stranger still, the GPS was showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The compass app was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Electronics always get screwed up near volcanic rock," David said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "The magnetic fields are all messed up." We tried to brush off our growing unease, but the drumming continued throughout the night. Sometimes it would fade to barely audible. Other times it would grow so loud it seemed to be coming from directly beneath our sleeping bags. None of us slept well, and I noticed that our small camp stove's flame, which should have burned blue, flickered with an unsettling greenish tint. Morning brought some relief. The drumming had stopped, and bright sunlight filtering through the canopy made our fears from the night before seem foolish. We decided to explore the valley, following the stream deeper into the forest toward the base of Hialau Falls. The hike was beautiful, but increasingly strange. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change around us. Trees that should have been familiar Hawaiian species began to look subtly wrong. Their bark too smooth, their leaves too geometric, their branches growing in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The stream we were following split and rejoined itself in ways that defied the geography we'd studied on our maps. "Are we lost?" Jennifer asked after we'd been hiking for what felt like hours. David consulted his compass, then his backup compass, then shook both with growing frustration. "They're both pointing in different directions. This is impossible." That's when Sarah screamed. She was standing about 20 feet ahead of us, pointing at something in the water. I rushed to her side and saw what had terrified her. A backpack, identical to mine, sitting at the bottom of the crystal-clear stream. But that wasn't the worst part. Next to it was a sleeping bag, and protruding from the sleeping bag was what looked like a human arm. "That's impossible," I whispered, looking down at my own pack, then back at the one in the water. "This has to be some kind of optical illusion." David waded into the stream, reaching for the submerged pack. The moment his hand touched it, the water around it began to turn dark red. He jerked his hand back with a cry of shock, and we watched in horror as the red spread throughout the stream, turning the clear mountain water the color of blood. "We need to get out of here," Jennifer said, her voice tight with panic. "Right now." But when we turned to retrace our steps, the path we'd followed was gone. Where there had been a clear trail just minutes before, there was now only impenetrable forest. The trees seemed to have moved closer together, their branches intertwining to form an unpassable barrier. "This is impossible," David kept repeating, pushing against the wall of vegetation. "We just came this way. There was a path here." I pulled out my map, trying to orient ourselves, but the paper felt wrong in my hands. Too rough, too thick. When I looked down at it, the familiar topographical lines were shifting and changing before my eyes, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no geographical sense. "Michael," Sarah whispered, grabbing my arm, "look." Following her gaze, I saw something that made my blood freeze. About 100 yards away, barely visible through the trees, was our campsite. But there were people there. 4 people sitting around what looked like our tents, eating what looked like our food. "That's us," Jennifer breathed. "That's us, but how is that possible?" The figures were too distant to make out clearly, but their body language, their posture, even the way they moved was unmistakably familiar. It was like watching ourselves from the outside. "We need to get closer," David said, but something in his voice had changed. It was flatter, more monotone than usual. "No," I said instinctively. "We should try to find another way out." But when I turned to speak to Sarah, she was gone. Just gone. One moment she was beside me, the next there was only empty space. "Sarah," I called out, spinning in a circle. "Sarah, where are you?" "She went toward the camp," David said, pointing toward our doppelgangers. "She said she wanted to get a better look." But I hadn't heard her say anything. I hadn't heard her move. It was as if she had simply vanished from reality. Jennifer and I ran toward the campsite, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grab at our clothes and skin with unusual persistence. But the faster we moved, the farther away the camp seemed to get. It was like trying to run through deep water. Every step required enormous effort, and our destination remained frustratingly distant. That's when I heard Sarah screaming. The sound was coming from behind us now, back toward the stream. We reversed direction, following her cries through the shifting maze of trees. When we finally found her, she was standing waist-deep in the bloody water, her arms wrapped around what looked like a human torso. "Help me," she sobbed. "I found David. Something happened to David." But David was standing right next to me. I looked at him, then back at Sarah, then at the thing she was holding. It was David, unmistakably David, but wrong. His skin was gray and cold-looking. His eyes were clouded over, and there was something terribly wrong with the way his limbs were positioned. "That's not me," David said calmly. "I'm right here." Sarah looked up at us with eyes that were wild with terror. "He's been in the water for days. His body... Michael, look at his body." I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. The David thing Sarah was holding was decomposing. Its skin was sloughing off in patches, revealing muscle and bone underneath. But it was moving. Its mouth was opening and closing as if trying to speak, and its eyes were tracking our movements. "Put it down," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, put it down and get out of the water." "I can't," she cried. "It's holding on to me. Its fingers, they're digging into my skin." That's when the David standing next to me began to laugh. It was David's laugh, but it went on too long and had an edge of madness that made my skin crawl. When I turned to look at him, his eyes had changed color. They were black now, completely black, with no whites visible. "This is all wrong," Jennifer whispered. "This is all so very wrong." I grabbed her hand and pulled her away from the water, away from both Davids, away from Sarah's screams. We ran blindly through the forest as the drumming started again, louder than ever, joined now by other sounds, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the sound of footsteps keeping pace with us, and worst of all, Sarah's voice calling my name from multiple directions at once. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing in what looked like another clearing. But this one was different from our campsite. The grass here was dead and brown, and scattered throughout the space were bones. Human bones, arranged in careful patterns that hurt to look at directly. "We're going to die here," Jennifer sobbed. "We're never getting out of this place." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I was beginning to understand that we had stumbled into something far beyond our comprehension. The valley itself was wrong. Time and space didn't work the way they should, and something was playing with us, toying with us like a cat with mice. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dead grass. They were our footprints, mine and Jennifer's, but they led in all directions from where we were sitting. Some looked fresh, others looked days old, and some looked like they'd been there for years. "How long have we been here?" Jennifer asked, following my gaze. I checked my watch, but it had stopped. When I looked at the sun through the canopy, it seemed to be in the same position it had been hours ago. Nothing was moving the way it should. "Jennifer," I said slowly. "I think we've been here before." She looked at me with growing horror. "What do you mean?" "I think we've done this before, many times. I think we're trapped." As if in response to my words, the forest around us began to change again. The dead clearing was transforming back into lush, tropical vegetation, the bones sinking into the ground and disappearing. Within minutes, we were sitting in what looked exactly like our original campsite, and there, emerging from the tree line, were Sarah and David. "There you are," Sarah called out cheerfully. "We've been looking everywhere for you. Where did you go?" But something was wrong with their faces. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright, and when they moved, it was with the jerky, unnatural motion of puppets being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. "We got worried when you wandered off," David said, his head tilting at an impossible angle. "This valley can be dangerous for people who don't know where they're going." Jennifer gripped my arm so tightly I could feel her nails breaking the skin. "Those aren't our friends," she whispered. The Sarah thing and David thing sat down across from us, their movements becoming more fluid and natural with each passing moment, as if whatever was controlling them was learning how to operate human bodies. "We should set up camp," the Sarah thing said. "It's getting dark." But the sun hadn't moved. It was still hanging in the same spot it had been all day, casting the same long shadows through the canopy. "Yes," the David thing agreed. "We have a long night ahead of us." I knew with absolute certainty that if we stayed in this clearing, if we allowed whatever was wearing our friends' faces to lull us into a false sense of security, we would never leave this valley. We would become part of whatever dark force controlled this place just like Sarah and David had. "We need to go," I whispered to Jennifer. "Right now." "Where?" she whispered back. "Where can we go? The forest changes every time we try to leave." I thought about the old Hawaiian man's warnings, about the night marchers and the spirits that walk the valley. I thought about the bones we'd seen, the impossible geography, the way time seemed to bend and twist around us. "Up," I said. "We need to go up, back to the cliff." The Sarah thing's head snapped toward us with predatory attention. "Where are you going? You just got here." "Just to get some water," I lied, slowly reaching for my pack. "There's water here," the David thing said, pointing to the stream that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. "No need to go anywhere." I grabbed Jennifer's hand and bolted for the tree line, pulling her with me as the things wearing our friends' faces began to scream, not with human voices, but with sounds no human throat could ever make. The screams followed us as we crashed through the underbrush, growing louder and more inhuman with each passing second. Behind us, I could hear them giving chase, but their footsteps sounded wrong. Too heavy, as if they weighed much more than Sarah and David ever had. The ground shook with each step, and I realized that whatever was pursuing us had abandoned any pretense of being human. We ran uphill, following what I hoped was the direction of the cliff face, as the forest grew darker around us despite the stationary sun. The trees here were ancient and massive, their trunks so wide that a dozen people couldn't have linked arms around them, and carved into their bark were symbols, spirals and angular designs that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Michael," Jennifer gasped as we paused to catch our breath, "look at the trees." The symbols weren't just carved into the bark, they were glowing with a faint, sickly green light. And as we watched, more symbols began to appear, spreading across the tree trunks like a disease. "They're marking our path," I realized. "They're showing something where we are." The drumming had returned louder than ever, and now I could hear voices mixed in with the rhythm, dozens of voices chanting in that unknown language. But these weren't the voices of our doppelgangers. These were older, deeper, speaking words that predated human civilization. We kept climbing, our legs burning with exhaustion, until we finally saw it. The cliff face rising impossibly high above us, its surface black volcanic rock that seemed to absorb the light around it. But the path we had descended was nowhere to be found. The cliff was smooth and unclimbable, stretching away in both directions until it disappeared into the twisted geography of the valley. There, Jennifer pointed to something that looked like a cave opening about 30 feet up the cliff face. If we can reach that, maybe we can hide until morning. It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. Using roots and small ledges as handholds, we began to climb. The rock was sharp and cut our hands and knees, but we kept going, driven by the sounds of pursuit growing closer behind us. The cave opening was larger than it had appeared from below, a natural lava tube that extended deep into the cliff. We crawled inside just as our pursuers emerged from the tree line below. Looking down, I saw them clearly for the first time. They still wore Sarah's and David's faces, but their bodies were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. And their skin had taken on the same sickly green glow as the symbols on the trees. "They can't reach us here," Jennifer whispered. But even as she said it, the things below began to change again. Their limbs stretched and elongated, their fingers extended into claws, and they began to climb the cliff face with the fluid motion of spiders. We crawled deeper into the cave, feeling our way along the rough walls in the darkness. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, sometimes opening into larger chambers, sometimes narrowing until we had to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for our bodies. Behind us, we could hear the scraping of claws on rock as our pursuers followed us into the tunnel system. But something else was happening too. The drumming was getting louder, and with it came the sound of footsteps. Many footsteps, coming from ahead of us. We were trapped between two forces, whatever was chasing us and whatever was waiting in the depths of the cave. The tunnel began to glow with that same green light, and I realized the walls were covered in symbols, thousands of them, spiraling deeper into the mountain in patterns that made my eyes water to follow. "This is a sacred place," Jennifer whispered, running her fingers over the glowing marks. "This is what the old man was trying to warn us about." The footsteps ahead of us were getting closer, and I could see shapes moving in the green glow. Tall, thin figures that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight. The Night Marchers, the spirits of ancient Hawaiian warriors who walked the old paths, defending sacred sites from intruders. "We don't belong here," I said, the understanding hitting me like a physical blow. "We violated something sacred, and now we're trapped between the spirits who guard this place and the things that feed on trespassers." The tunnel began to shake, and chunks of rock fell from the ceiling. The green glow was getting brighter, and I could hear voices, not chanting now, but speaking clearly in Hawaiian. They were angry voices, full of righteous fury at our presence in their sacred space. "I'm sorry," I called out into the darkness ahead of us. "We didn't know. We didn't mean to disturb this place." The shaking stopped. The voices fell silent. Even the sounds of pursuit from behind us ceased. In the sudden quiet, a new voice spoke, an old woman's voice, speaking accented English. "You brought evil into our valley," she said. "You fed it with your fear and your disrespect. Now it wears the faces of your friends and grows stronger." A figure emerged from the green glow, an elderly Hawaiian woman dressed in traditional kapa cloth, her long gray hair adorned with male leaves. But she was translucent, clearly a spirit rather than a living person. "We can undo this," she continued, "but you must make a choice. One of you must stay to feed the hungry spirits to satisfy their need for mortal essence. The other may leave and seal this place forever." I looked at Jennifer, seeing my own despair reflected in her eyes. "There has to be another way." The spirit woman shook her head sadly. "This is the price of trespass. This is the way it has always been." Behind us, the scraping sounds resumed as our pursuers drew closer. Ahead of us, the Night Marchers waited in judgment. And in the middle, Jennifer and I faced an impossible choice. That's when I remembered something the old man at the equipment shop had said. The valley remembers everything. If that was true, then maybe there was another way. "The valley remembers," I said to the spirit woman. "It remembers the past. But can it remember the future?" She tilted her head, studying me with ancient eyes. "What do you mean, young one?" "We're not the first tourists to come here. We're not the first to make this mistake, but we could be the last. If you let us go, we'll make sure no one else ever disturbs this place. We'll guard it from the outside, the way you guard it from within." The spirit woman was quiet for a long moment, consulting with voices I couldn't hear. Finally, she nodded. "The valley will test your resolve," she said. "If you speak truth, you will find your path. If you lie, you will join the hungry spirits forever." The green glow began to fade, and I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if the mountain itself was moving around us. When the light returned, we were standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down into Waipio Valley as the first light of dawn broke over the rim. Our campsite was visible far below, and I could see two figures moving around it. But from this distance, I couldn't tell if they were really Sarah and David or the things that had taken their place. "We have to go down," Jennifer said. "We have to find out what happened to them." But I knew the truth. Sarah and David were gone. Whatever was moving around our campsite wasn't human, and it would be waiting for us if we returned. "No," I said firmly. "We climb out, we get help, we make sure this place is protected so no one else goes through what we went through." Jennifer stared at me, then at the valley below. "But what if they're alive? What if they're trapped down there?" I pointed to the campsite, where one of the figures had noticed us and was waving enthusiastically. Even from this distance, I could see that its arm bent in ways that human arms simply couldn't bend. "That's not them," I said. "That's not them anymore." The climb out of the valley was treacherous, but we made it. We reached the rim as the sun was fully up, and I immediately called the police on my newly functional phone. I told them we'd gotten separated from our friends during a hiking accident, that we'd spent the night lost in the forest, and that we needed search and rescue teams. The teams went down into the valley and found our campsite. They found Sarah's and David's sleeping bags, their clothes, even their personal belongings. But they never found Sarah and David themselves. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. Jennifer and I never spoke about what really happened. We both moved away from Hawaii within a month, and we've never contacted each other since. But I kept my promise to the spirit woman. I spent years researching Waipio Valley, learning about its sacred significance to native Hawaiian culture, about the burial sites and ancient temples hidden in its depths. I used my job in environmental law to help get the area designated as culturally sensitive, making it much harder for casual tourists to access the remote areas where we had camped. But sometimes, late at night, I get emails from hiking forums and travel blogs, people asking about that amazing camping spot they found on satellite images deep in the valley. People who've seen my name on environmental protection documents and want insider information about the best places to explore. I always respond the same way. I tell them about the cultural significance of the valley, about the need to respect sacred sites, about the dangerous terrain and unpredictable weather. I do everything I can to discourage them from making the same mistake we made. But some people don't listen. Some people think they know better. And sometimes, very rarely, I see their names in the missing persons reports. Young people who went hiking in remote areas of Hawaii and were never seen again. Their bodies are never found, but their campsites are discovered intact, as if they simply vanished into thin air. I know where they went. I know what happened to them. And I know that somewhere in the depths of Waipio Valley, something wearing their faces is waiting for the next group of tourists to discover that perfect, isolated camping spot. The valley remembers everything, including how to be hungry. I still have nightmares about that place. In my dreams, I'm back in the forest, watching the symbols glow on the trees while voices chant in languages older than civilization. Sometimes I dream about Sarah and David, but in these dreams, they're standing at the edge of my bed, smiling too wide and moving in that horrible puppet-like way. "Why did you leave us?" they ask in voices that sound like wind through dead leaves. Why didn't you stay and play? I always wake up screaming. 3 years ago, I got a wedding invitation in the mail. Jennifer was getting married to someone she'd met in Oregon, where she'd moved after leaving Hawaii. I was surprised she'd tracked me down, but when I called the number on the invitation, no one had ever heard of her. When I looked up the address, it was a vacant lot. Last month, I got a postcard from Hawaii. On the front was a picture of Waipio Valley, beautiful and green and inviting. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as Jennifer's, was a simple message: "Come back and visit. We miss you. Jay." But Jennifer never knew about the postcard's sender address. She never knew I'd moved to Portland after leaving Honolulu. She couldn't have known where to find me, unless something that remembered her handwriting, something that knew about our shared experience, wanted me to return to that valley. I burned the postcard, but I kept thinking about it, about how perfect that clearing had been, about how the grass was too uniform and too well maintained, about how there were no animal tracks or droppings anywhere in that space. I think I understand now why it was so perfect. It was a trap, a lure designed to attract people like us, young, adventurous, disrespectful of boundaries. The valley itself was hunting, using our own desires for pristine wilderness against us. And I think it's still hunting, still learning, getting better at its lures, more sophisticated in its methods. Because yesterday, I got another message. This time it was a text from Sarah's phone number, the number that was disconnected 3 years ago. The message just said, "The camping spot is even better now. You should see how we've improved it. I've changed my phone number. I've moved to a new city. I've done everything I can to cut ties with that place and that experience, but I know it's not enough. The valley remembers everything, and it's patient. Sooner or later, it will find a way to call me home. Sometimes I think about going back, not to camp, but to end this somehow, to face whatever is wearing my friends' faces and settle this once and for all. But I know that's exactly what it wants me to think. It's been playing a long game, wearing me down, making me feel guilty about leaving Sarah and David behind, making me think I can somehow save them or put them to rest. The truth is, there's nothing left to save. Whatever Sarah and David were, whatever made them human, was consumed by that place years ago. What remains is just bait, designed to lure me back to feed the hungry spirits that guard the valley's secrets. So I stay away. I keep my promise to the spirit woman. I do everything I can to protect other people from making our mistake, but I know it's only a matter of time. The valley is patient, and it remembers everything, including how to wait. And sometimes in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, I can hear drumming in the distance, getting closer. Boom, boom, boom. Like footsteps, like a heartbeat, like something ancient and hungry, calling me home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Waimanu Valley on the Big Island of Hawaii, a place that most tourists never see, hidden beyond the more famous Waipio Valley like a secret the island keeps to itself. I should have listened to the old Hawaiian man at the trailhead. His weathered face had creased with genuine concern when he saw our permits for the 7-mile hike into Waimanu. "Plenty good places stay on this island," he'd said in his thick pidgin, shaking his head. "Why you folks going way out there? Dat valley, she no like visitors much." But we were young, confident, and stupid. Sarah Rodriguez, my girlfriend of 2 years, had been planning this trip for months. David Jones, my college roommate, and Jennifer Williams, Sarah's best friend since high school, had flown in from the mainland specifically for this adventure. We were going to be among the few people each year who made the treacherous journey to one of Hawaii's most isolated valleys, camping where ancient Hawaiians once lived before abandoning the place centuries ago. The hike started at dawn from the end of the Waipio Valley Road. The trail immediately plunged us into dense tropical rainforest, the kind of green that seems to swallow light and sound. Massive tree ferns unfurled like prehistoric umbrellas overhead, and the air hung thick with moisture and the sweet rot of decomposing vegetation. Everything dripped constantly, not from rain, but from the perpetual condensation that forms when warm air meets the cool mountain valleys. "Jesus, it's like walking through a lung," David muttered, adjusting his pack straps. Sweat had already started beading on his pale forehead, and we'd only been hiking for 30 minutes. Jennifer laughed, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she navigated a fallen log. "Come on, Dave. Where's your sense of adventure? This is paradise." But as we descended deeper into the valley, something began to feel wrong. Not obviously wrong, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." Just a growing sense of unease that settled into my chest like a cold stone. The forest was too quiet. In all my years of hiking, I'd never been in a tropical environment this devoid of animal sounds. No birds called from the canopy. No insects buzzed. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Sarah noticed it too. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her dark eyes scanning the green shadows behind us. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked during our first rest stop. "It's just the trees," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "They're so thick here, everything feels enclosed." But I was lying. It wasn't just the trees. There was something else, a presence that seemed to move parallel to us through the forest, always just beyond the edge of vision. When I turned to look, I caught glimpses of movement that could have been wind in the branches, or could have been something else entirely. The trail wound downward for hours, following ancient stone terraces that spoke of the Hawaiian farmers who had once called this valley home. We passed remnants of their lives, moss-covered stone foundations, irrigation channels carved into the rock, taro patches long since reclaimed by the jungle. The archaeological sites should have been fascinating, but they only added to my growing sense of wrongness. Why had the Hawaiians abandoned this fertile valley? What had driven them away from a place so rich with resources? By late afternoon, we reached the valley floor. Waimanu opened before us like a green cathedral, its walls rising nearly 2,000 feet on either side, carved by countless centuries of wind and water. A stream meandered through the valley bottom, eventually reaching the black sand beach where it met the Pacific. It was stunningly beautiful and utterly isolated. We were now 7 miles from the nearest road with no cell service and no way to call for help if something went wrong. "This is incredible," Jennifer breathed, pulling out her camera. But when she tried to take a picture, the device wouldn't turn on. "That's weird. The battery was full this morning." David checked his phone. Dead. Sarah's GPS unit showed nothing but static. My own phone, which had been working fine at the trailhead, now displayed only a black screen. "Solar flare activity, maybe?" I suggested, though I knew it was unlikely. More likely, the valley's position between towering ridges was blocking all signals. But the synchronized failure of all our electronics felt deliberate, planned, as if something didn't want us documenting our presence here. We made camp near the beach, on a flat area that showed signs of previous use. A fire ring made of black volcanic stones. Tent sites cleared of the worst vegetation. As I set up our tents, I found myself studying the tree line that bordered our campsite. The shadows between the trunks seemed deeper than they should be, given the amount of ambient light. And those shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Mike, you're being paranoid," Sarah said, noticing my constant glances toward the forest. She was building a fire in the existing ring, feeding dry wood to flames that stubbornly refused to take hold. "Help me with this. The wood keeps going out." I knelt beside her and examined the setup. Everything looked right. Dry tinder, proper ventilation, enough kindling. But the flames kept dying, as if something was actively smothering them. When we finally got a stable fire going, the smoke didn't rise straight up as it should have. Instead, it swirled in bizarre patterns, forming shapes that reminded me of reaching fingers or grasping hands. "The wind must be weird down here," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. There was no wind. The valley air hung perfectly still, so motionless that our perspiration didn't evaporate. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. The tropical warmth of the day gave way to a bone-deep chill that our fire couldn't seem to touch. We huddled close to the flames, sharing lukewarm soup and trail mix, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid to disturb something. Jennifer was the first to notice the sounds. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, tilting her head toward the forest. We all listened. At first, there was nothing but the distant crash of waves on the beach. Then, gradually, other sounds emerged from the darkness. Footsteps, but not quite right. The rhythm was off, as if whatever was walking had too many legs or was trying to mimic human movement without quite understanding it. The steps circled our camp, staying just beyond the firelight, sometimes approaching close enough that we could hear the snap of twigs underfoot. "Probably just wild pigs," I said, though I'd never heard of pigs moving with such deliberate stealth. "Pigs don't walk like that," Sarah murmured. Her hands shook as she poured more coffee from our thermos. The circling continued for hours. Sometimes the footsteps would pause directly behind one of our tents, and we could hear breathing. Long, rattling inhalations that sounded almost mechanical. Other times there would be scratching sounds, as if claws were being dragged across tree bark. The fire began to burn with strange colors, blues and greens that had no place in a normal wood fire, and the smoke formed shapes that became increasingly disturbing. I saw what looked like faces in the swirling gray wisps, features twisted in agony or rage. None of us slept well that first night. We took turns keeping watch, but whatever was out there stayed hidden. When dawn finally broke, the sounds ceased abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown. In the growing light, I ventured to the edge of our camp to look for tracks. What I found made my blood freeze. The prints in the soft earth weren't from any animal I recognized. They were roughly human-shaped but wrong in fundamental ways. Too long, with what appeared to be extra toes or claws. And they weren't just around our camp. They went right through it. Between our tents, around our fire ring, whatever had made them had walked among us while we slept, close enough to touch us through the thin nylon walls. "We should leave," Sarah said when I showed her the tracks. Her face had gone pale, and I could see the fear she was trying to hide. "This place feels wrong. Mike, really wrong." But David and Jennifer argued for staying. We'd hiked 7 miles to get here, they reasoned. We'd only been there one night. It would be stupid to give up so easily. Jennifer in particular seemed almost aggressively cheerful about the situation, dismissing our concerns with forced laughter. "You're both being ridiculous," she said, adjusting her backpack straps. "They're just animal tracks. Maybe from a feral dog or something. Besides, I want to explore the upper valley today. There's supposed to be waterfalls up there." Looking back, I should have recognized the change in Jennifer then. But at the time, I attributed her behavior to typical Jennifer optimism. She'd always been the one to push us toward new adventures, to talk us out of our comfort zones. It seemed natural that she'd want to press on despite the strange events of the night before. We spent the day hiking deeper into the valley, following faint game trails toward the towering waterfalls that tumbled down the valley walls. The upper reaches of Waimanu were even more primordial than the area near the beach. Massive boulders, some as large as houses, lay scattered across the landscape as if hurled there by giants. Ancient lava tubes created tunnels through the rock, their mouths yawning like hungry throats. It was near one of these lava tubes that Jennifer disappeared. We had stopped for lunch beside a particularly large boulder that provided some shade from the relentless sun. Jennifer had wandered off, ostensibly to relieve herself, heading toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. When she didn't return after 15 minutes, I called out to her. No response. David and Sarah helped me search. We found her footprints leading toward the rocks, but they simply ended at the entrance to a narrow lava tube. The opening was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, disappearing into absolute blackness. I called her name into the darkness and heard only my echo returning, distorted and strange. "Jennifer!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "Jennifer, if you're in there, this isn't funny." We waited. We called. We threw rocks into the tube to try to provoke a response. Nothing. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed her whole. "We have to go in after her," David said, pulling a flashlight from his pack. But when he switched it on, the beam barely penetrated a few feet into the tube before being absorbed by the darkness. The light seemed to die unnaturally quickly, as if the blackness was actively consuming it. "No," I said firmly. "We don't know how deep that goes or if it's safe. Jennifer's smart. She wouldn't have gone in there without telling us. She must have come back out and gone somewhere else." But as we expanded our search, it became clear that Jennifer hadn't gone anywhere else. Her tracks led to the lava tube and nowhere else. Whatever had happened to her had happened there, in that throat of stone that led deep into the earth. We searched until dark, calling her name until our voices gave out. As night fell, we had no choice but to return to our camp and hope she would find her way back. But deep down, I knew something terrible had happened. The valley had taken her, just as it had taken the ancient Hawaiians who once lived here. That second night was worse than the first. The footsteps returned, but now they seemed more numerous, as if our group had been joined by additional watchers. The sounds were more aggressive too, scraping against our tents, heavy breathing just outside the thin walls, and worst of all, voices. They started as whispers, so soft I thought I was imagining them. But gradually they grew louder, more distinct. They spoke in English, but the words were wrong, strung together in ways that made no grammatical sense. "Come out, come out. The dark is warm, the dark is home. Come home, come out." Around midnight, the voices began to mimic us. I heard my own voice calling from the forest. "Sarah, David, help me, I'm lost." But I was sitting right beside the fire. Sarah heard her own voice pleading from the darkness. "Mike, please come find me. I'm hurt, I need help." The mimicry was perfect, down to the inflection and emotional tone, but we could see each other clearly in the firelight. "It's trying to lure us out there," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Whatever it is, it's learning our voices." But the worst moment came around 3 a.m., when we heard Jennifer's voice. "Guys, where did everybody go? I'm back. I found the most amazing cave system back there. You have to see it." The voice was coming from just beyond the firelight, and it sounded exactly like Jennifer. Cheerful, excited, completely normal. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe she really had gotten lost in the caves and was just now finding her way back. Then I saw the figure at the edge of the light. It was Jennifer, but wrong. Her proportions were subtly off. Arms too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her smile was too wide, stretching across her face in a way that human facial muscles shouldn't allow. And her eyes. Her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, glowing with an inner phosphorescence that made my skin crawl. "Come on," the thing wearing Jennifer's face said, taking a step closer. "Don't you want to see what I found? It's so beautiful down there. So peaceful. You'll love it." David started to stand and I grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. "That's not Jennifer," I hissed. The thing's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw something else looking out through Jennifer's stolen features. Something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "Of course it's me," it said, but the voice was slightly off now, the pitch not quite right. "Who else would it be? Come on, Mike, you know me. You've known me for years." "Prove it," Sarah said suddenly. "Tell us something only Jennifer would know." The creature's smile never wavered, but it didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head further, studying us with those glowing eyes. When it finally spoke, the words came out in Jennifer's voice but with a cadence that belonged to something else entirely. "We went to that concert in Portland. the one where you threw up on David's shoes. It was a real memory, but one that any of us could have known. Jennifer would have been more specific, would have mentioned the band's name or made a joke about David's reaction. This thing was fishing, using scraps of overheard conversations to try to convince us it was our friend. "Get away from us," I said, standing slowly and grabbing a burning stick from the fire. "Whatever you are, get the hell away from us." The creature's expression shifted, the fake cheerfulness draining away to reveal something cold and predatory. Jennifer's stolen face contorted into a snarl that no human mouth should be able to make. "She tasted so sweet," it said in a voice like grinding stone. Her fear, her confusion as I wore her skin. "She's still in here with me, you know, still aware, still screaming." The thing that looked like Jennifer began to change, its limbs elongated, joints bending in impossible directions. The skin rippled and stretched, revealing glimpses of something dark and scaled underneath. But the worst part was that it kept Jennifer's face, even as the rest of its body transformed into something nightmarish. "Who wants to join her?" it asked, taking another step forward. "Who wants to come play in the deep places where the sun never shines?" I swung the burning branch at it, and the creature recoiled with a shriek that sounded like metal tearing. The fire seemed to cause it genuine pain, and for a moment, its stolen form flickered, revealing glimpses of its true nature, something reptilian and ancient, with too many teeth and eyes like black holes. The thing retreated into the darkness, but its voice followed us. "You can't leave, you know. The trail is gone. The way out is closed. This valley keeps what it catches." We spent the rest of the night huddled together, feeding the fire and watching the darkness. None of us spoke about what we'd seen, as if putting it into words would make it more real than it already was. When dawn finally came, we packed our things with desperate efficiency and headed for the trail that would take us home. But the creature had been telling the truth. The trail was gone. Where clear markers and worn paths had existed 2 days before, there was now only impenetrable jungle. We spent hours searching for the route we'd taken into the valley, but every direction we tried led to dead ends, cliff faces that hadn't been there before, streams that flowed in the wrong directions, forests so dense that we couldn't push through them. "This is impossible," David said, staring at his useless map. "Trails don't just disappear. We came down that ridge right there." He pointed to what should have been our exit route, but the slope was now covered in vegetation so thick it looked like it had been growing undisturbed for centuries. As the day wore on, our situation became increasingly desperate. We were trapped in a valley that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking, stalked by something that wore our friend's face and promised horrors beyond imagination. Our water was running low, our food wouldn't last more than a day or two, and every hour we spent in this place felt like we were losing more of ourselves to whatever malevolent force controlled it. The second night was a waking nightmare. The creature returned, sometimes looking like Jennifer, sometimes shifting into other forms. People we'd known, family members, even versions of ourselves. It played psychological games, trying to convince us to give up, to accept our fate and join it in whatever hell existed beneath the valley floor. But the worst part was the doubt it planted in our minds. Was any of this real? Had we actually seen Jennifer transform? Or were we suffering from some kind of shared psychosis brought on by stress and isolation? The creature exploited these doubts, appearing during moments when our guard was down and speaking in perfectly normal voices about perfectly mundane things. It would chat about the weather or ask about our plans for the next day, as if we were all just old friends on a camping trip. These moments of apparent normalcy were more terrifying than its obvious threats because they made us question our own perceptions. Maybe we were losing our minds. Maybe the isolation and fear were making us see things that weren't there. Maybe Jennifer really had fallen into a lava tube and died, and grief was causing us to hallucinate monsters. But then I would look at Sarah and David and see the same terror in their eyes that I felt in my heart, and I knew that whatever was happening to us was real. On the third day, something changed. The oppressive atmosphere of the valley lifted slightly, and we found what appeared to be a new trail leading up the valley wall. It wasn't the route we'd taken in, but it was a way out, and we took it without hesitation. The climb was brutal, nearly vertical in places with loose rock that threatened to send us tumbling back to the valley floor, but desperation gave us strength, and after hours of exhausting effort, we reached the ridgetop. From there, we could see the ocean and, more importantly, the familiar landmarks that would guide us back to civilization. The hike out took the rest of the day. We moved in tense silence, constantly looking over our shoulders, expecting the creature to appear and drag us back to its domain. But as we put distance between ourselves and Waimanu Valley, the sense of immediate danger began to fade. By the time we reached the parking area where we'd left David's rental car, I was almost convinced that we'd escaped. Almost. Because as we drove away from the trailhead, I looked back one last time at the valley entrance. And there, standing at the tree line, was Jennifer. The real Jennifer, not the twisted thing that had worn her face. She looked exactly as she had 3 days ago. Blonde ponytail, bright smile, hiking clothes. She waved at us cheerfully, as if nothing had happened, but her feet didn't quite touch the ground. We reported Jennifer missing to the authorities, of course. Search and rescue teams combed Waimanu Valley for weeks, using helicopters and specialized equipment. They found no trace of her, no body, no clothing, no sign that she'd ever been there at all. The official report concluded that she had either fallen into one of the many crevices in the valley floor or been swept out to sea by the stream. Sarah and I broke up 2 months later. We couldn't look at each other without remembering what we'd seen, what we'd lost. She moved back to the mainland and changed her number. Last I heard, she was seeing a therapist and taking medication for anxiety and insomnia. David lasted longer, but he started drinking heavily and couldn't hold down a job. The last time I saw him, he was talking about going back to Hawaii, about returning to Waimanu Valley to finish what we started. I tried to talk him out of it, but he had that same look in his eyes that Jennifer had worn right before she disappeared, a kind of hungry eagerness that didn't belong to the David I'd known. He flew to Hawaii 6 months ago. The news report said he was found at the bottom of a cliff near the Waimanu trailhead, apparently having fallen while hiking alone. But I know better. The valley called him back, just like it tried to call me back every night in my dreams. I still hear Jennifer's voice sometimes, usually right as I'm falling asleep. She tells me about the beautiful things she's seen in the deep places, about the friends she's made in the darkness. She says she's not alone down there, that there are others who came before us, others who will come after. She promises that if I return to Waimanu, she'll show me wonders beyond imagination. But I remember the thing that wore her face, remember the cold hunger in those glowing eyes. Whatever Jennifer has become, whatever the valley turned her into, it's not my friend anymore. It's something that feeds on fear and flesh and the essence of what makes us human. So I stay away from Hawaii, away from green valleys and remote trails. I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and electric lights, as far from the wilderness as I can get. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can smell the damp earth and rotting vegetation of Waimanu Valley. And I know that someday, despite all my precautions, the valley will call me home. Because some places never let you leave. Some places mark you, claim you, make you part of their dark ecology whether you want to be or not. And Waimanu Valley is patient. It can wait decades for me to weaken, for my resolve to crumble, for the dreams and whispered promises to finally break down my defenses. When that day comes, and I know it will come, I'll pack a bag and buy a plane ticket and make the long hike back to that cursed place. I'll walk past the old Hawaiian man at the trailhead, past his warnings and concerned looks, down into the green cathedral where Jennifer waits for me with her too wide smile and glowing eyes. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, she'll kill me quickly. But I don't think I'll be that lucky. I think she'll want to play first. to taste my fear the way something tasted hers. I think she'll want to show me all the beautiful, terrible things she's learned in the deep places beneath the valley floor. And I think, in the end, I'll join her there in the darkness, adding my voice to the chorus that calls to other hikers, other adventurers foolish enough to venture into places where humans were never meant to go. The old Hawaiian man at the trailhead was right. Some valleys don't like visitors, and some valleys never let them leave. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Waimanu Valley on Hawaii's Big Island, where the ancient volcanic cliffs drop into an abyss of green, so deep it seems to swallow sound itself. The plan had been simple enough when Brian Wright and I discussed it over beers in Hilo 3 weeks earlier. Two old college friends, both trapped in the suffocating routine of office jobs, desperate for an adventure that would remind us we were still alive. Brian had found the trail online, a grueling 9-mile hike down switchbacks carved into 1,000-foot cliffs, ending in a black sand beach valley that maybe a dozen people visited each year. It's like stepping back in time, Brian had said, his eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen since our fraternity days at Oregon State. No cell service, no tourists, no civilization. Just us and whatever the islands were like before anyone else got there. I should have paid more attention to that phrase. Whatever the islands were like before anyone else got there. The morning we started the hike, a thick blanket of clouds hung low over the Kohala Mountains, and the air carried that heavy, electric feeling that comes before tropical storms. Brian had insisted we go anyway. We'd already taken the time off work, driven the 3 hours from Kona, and camping reservations were impossible to reschedule. Besides, he'd said, shouldering his pack with that crooked grin that had gotten us into trouble more times than I could count, a little rain never killed anyone. Brian was always the risk-taker between us. Where I calculated odds and planned contingencies, he dove headfirst into experiences with an almost manic intensity. It's what made him a brilliant sales director and a terrifying hiking partner. He'd been the one to talk me into skydiving in college, into taking that sketchy job in Thailand after graduation, into moving to Hawaii in the first place when the tech company I'd been working for offered a transfer. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through pasture land dotted with wild horses and the occasional abandoned car slowly being reclaimed by rust and vegetation. But as we descended toward the first valley, the path narrowed to barely 2 feet wide, carved into cliff faces that dropped away into empty air. One slip meant a fall of several hundred feet onto jagged rocks below. Jesus, I muttered, pressing my back against the cliff wall as a gust of wind tried to push me toward the edge. You didn't mention this part was basically a death trap. That's what makes it exciting, Brian called back, already 20 feet ahead and moving with the confidence of someone who'd never met a risk he couldn't charm his way through. Besides, the ancient Hawaiians used to walk this path all the time. If they could do it barefoot, we can manage it with hiking boots. That was the first time I noticed something odd in his voice. A slight rasp, like he'd been smoking, though Brian had quit years ago. But the trail demanded too much concentration for me to dwell on it. Every step required absolute focus, every handhold a careful test of crumbling volcanic rock. It took us 4 hours to reach the valley floor, and by then the clouds had thickened to an ominous gray-black that seemed to press down on us like a living thing. The silence was absolute except for our breathing and the distant crash of waves against the black sand beach. No bird calls, no insect sounds, nothing that indicated the valley supported any life at all. "This is incredible," Brian whispered, but his voice carried an odd quality in the stillness, like an echo that came from the wrong direction. It's like the whole world just stopped. He was right. The feeling was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. That makes you speak in whispers even when there's no reason to be quiet. We set up camp near a grove of coconut palms about a quarter mile from the beach, choosing a spot that offered some protection from the wind while keeping us away from the cliff faces that loomed like black walls on 3 sides of the valley. The 4th side opened to the ocean, but even that felt wrong somehow. The waves moved in patterns that didn't match the wind, and the foam they threw up seemed too white, too bright against the black sand. "Check this out," Brian said, crouching near what looked like an old fire ring. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, but they were covered with a peculiar blue-green moss that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at it. Someone's been camping here before. I knelt beside him and immediately felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The smell coming from the fire ring was indescribable. Not quite rotting vegetation, not quite sulfur, but something that made my hindbrain scream warnings about disease and death. "We should find another spot," I said, standing quickly and taking several steps back. "Don't be paranoid, Ken. It's just old seaweed or something." Brian ran his fingers through the moss, and I could have sworn I saw it wrap around his hand like tiny tendrils before he pulled away. "Besides, this is the only flat ground for 100 yards in any direction." He was right about that. The rest of the valley floor was either too rocky, too swampy, or too close to what looked like an ancient lava tube that disappeared into the cliff face. So we pitched our tents in the grove, though I made sure mine was as far from the fire ring as possible while still being under the shelter of the palms. As we worked, I found myself glancing at Brian more frequently than usual. Nothing obvious, just small things that didn't quite fit. The way he moved was slightly off, like someone trying to remember how walking worked. His laugh came a fraction of a second too late when I made jokes, and his eyes, normally a warm brown, seemed to reflect light in a way that made them appear almost yellow in the dim afternoon light. "You feeling okay?" I asked as we finished setting up camp. "Never better," he replied, but his smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Why?" I don't know. You seem different since we got down here." "It's the valley, man. It changes you, makes you feel more connected to something primal." He inhaled deeply, his eyes closing. "Can't you feel it? The power of this place?" I could feel something, but it wasn't power. It was wrongness, like the sensation of being watched by something that understood you better than you understood yourself. The kind of feeling that made every instinct scream at you to run, even when logic insisted there was nothing to run from. By evening, the clouds had descended so low they brushed the tops of the coconut palms, and a fine mist began to fall that wasn't quite rain but soaked through everything anyway. We huddled in my tent to cook dinner on my camp stove, since Brian's had mysteriously stopped working despite being brand new. "Probably just the altitude change," he'd said, but we were barely 100 feet above sea level. As we ate our dehydrated pasta, I noticed Brian wasn't really eating so much as moving food around in his bowl. When I commented on it, he looked up with that too wide smile again. "Guess I'm not as hungry as I thought. All this fresh air and exercise, you know? Sometimes it suppresses the appetite." That might have made sense if we hadn't been hiking for 10 hours and burning thousands of calories, but I let it slide. Brian had always been weird about food, too focused on staying in shape, too concerned with maintaining the perfect physique that had served him well in college and continued to open doors in his sales career. What bothered me more was the way he kept glancing toward the lava tube entrance we could see from our campsite. It was just a black opening in the cliff face, maybe 8 feet wide and perfectly circular, like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Local legends claimed tubes like that were entrances to Pele's domain, sacred spaces where the volcano goddess could emerge from the Earth's core to walk among mortals. "What do you think is in there?" Brian asked, nodding toward the opening. "Probably just goes back into the cliff a few feet and then dead ends. Most of these tubes collapsed centuries ago. But what if it doesn't?" His voice carried an eager quality that made my skin crawl. "What if it goes all the way through the mountain? Imagine what we might find." "Unstable rock formations and a good way to get ourselves killed," I said firmly. "We're not going in there, Brian." He didn't respond, just kept staring at the tube entrance with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. In the flickering light of our camp stove, his face looked different. angular in places it hadn't been before, with shadows that fell wrong around his eyes and cheekbones. We turned in early, partly because there was nothing else to do without a fire, and partly because I hoped a good night's sleep would help Brian shake off whatever weird mood had settled over him. But sleep didn't come easily. The mist had thickened to a proper fog that muffled all sound, creating a sensation of being suspended in white nothingness. Every time I started to drift off, some small sound would jerk me awake. The rustle of fabric, the whisper of feet on sand, the soft sound of breathing that seemed to come from outside my tent. Around midnight, I heard my tent zipper opening. I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing, listening through the thin nylon wall. Footsteps moved away from the tent, soft and careful, heading in the direction of the lava tube. Brian must have decided to explore on his own, despite my warnings about the danger. I waited 10 minutes, then unzipped my sleeping bag and pulled on my boots. The fog was so thick I could barely see 3 feet in any direction, but I could hear movement ahead of me, heading steadily toward the cliff face. I followed the sound, using my phone's flashlight on its dimmest setting to avoid tripping over rocks or holes. The entrance to the lava tube loomed out of the fog like the mouth of some massive creature. The perfectly circular opening was about 8 feet in diameter and smooth as glass around the edges. My light penetrated maybe 15 feet into the tunnel before being swallowed by absolute darkness. "Brian," I whispered, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the tunnel itself, producing no echo. I heard something from deep within the tube. Not quite a voice, not quite a sound, but something that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was rhythmic, like chanting, but in a language that didn't sound human. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, and I found myself taking a step toward the entrance before I caught myself. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't Brian. I backed away from the tube and returned to camp, where I discovered Brian's tent was empty but still zipped closed from the inside. His sleeping bag was unzipped, but his boots and clothes were still there, which meant he'd gone into the tunnel barefoot and wearing only his underwear. In weather that had dropped into the 50s with the fog. I spent the rest of the night sitting outside my tent with my largest knife in my hand, staring at the lava tube entrance and listening to sounds that couldn't possibly be coming from something human. The chanting would stop for long periods, replaced by other noises. Scratching, like claws on rock, and a wet, sliding sound that made my stomach turn. Sometimes I thought I heard laughter, but it was too high-pitched, too delighted in a way that spoke of madness or cruelty. Dawn came slowly, the fog lifting in wisps that revealed the valley inch by inch. When full daylight finally penetrated the mist, I saw Brian walking back toward camp from the direction of the beach. He was fully dressed, dry despite the moisture that had soaked through everything else and moving with that same off-kilter gait I'd noticed the day before. "Morning, Ken," he called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing. "Where were you?" "Just went for a walk. Couldn't sleep with all that fog." He smiled, but it was wrong in every possible way. The proportions were off, like someone had told him how smiles worked but had never actually seen one. "You worry too much, buddy." "You went into the lava tube." "Did I?" He tilted his head to one side and I could have sworn I heard his neck vertebrae pop. Funny, I don't remember that at all. The thing wearing Brian's face moved past me toward the camp and I caught a scent that made my vision blur with revulsion. It wasn't quite the smell of decay, but something worse. The smell of something that had never been alive trying to mimic life, sweet and cloying with undertones of metal and earth. "We should head back today," I said, following him. "Weather's getting worse and I don't like the look of those clouds." "Are you kidding?" He turned to look at me and I saw that his eyes had definitely changed color overnight. They were now a pale yellow-green like infected pus. "We just got here. Besides, I found something amazing in that cave system. You have to see it." "I'm not going in there, Brian." "Of course you are." His voice had taken on a strange sing-song quality. "Because if you don't, I'll have to tell everyone back home about what really happened to your sister." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. My sister Amanda had died in a car accident when I was 17, an accident that had been my fault because I'd been the one driving drunk, though I'd never told anyone the truth. The official report blamed mechanical failure, and I'd carried the guilt for 11 years without ever speaking about it. Brian had never known about my sister at all. "How do you—" "I know lots of things now," he said, that horrible smile spreading wider across his face. "The dark shows you secrets when you know how to listen, and you're going to come into the dark with me, Kenneth Young, age 28, driver's license number." He rattled off a string of numbers that included not just my license number, but my social security number, my bank account details, and the address of the apartment I'd lived in when I was 12. Information no human being could possibly have. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm your friend Brian," he replied, but his voice was layered now, like multiple people speaking in unison. "I'm the thing that lives in the dark places of this island. I'm the hunger that has been waiting in the tunnels for someone to feed me secrets and flesh, and the warm, copper taste of fear." He took a step toward me, and I saw that his feet weren't quite touching the ground. He was hovering perhaps an inch above the sand, and where his feet should have cast shadows, there was only more of that writhing blue-green moss. "The real Brian is still alive," the thing continued conversationally. "Down in the deep places, learning new ways to scream. Would you like to hear him? He's been calling your name all night." From somewhere far below us, muffled by tons of rock, I heard a sound that might have been my name if it were being screamed by someone whose throat had been torn to shreds. I ran. There was no thought involved, no plan, just the pure animal terror that overrides every rational process and sends you fleeing from danger with whatever strength your body can muster. I sprinted toward the trail that would take me out of the valley, leaving everything behind. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, everything except the clothes I was wearing and the knife still clutched in my hand. Behind me, I heard laughter that sounded like breaking glass and tearing metal. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, the thing that had been wearing Brian's face was following me, but not running. It was gliding above the ground with the patient, inexorable movement of something that knew I couldn't escape. The trail up the cliff face was a nightmare under the best of conditions. Attempting it while in a state of pure panic, with hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the rock, was almost certainly suicide. But staying in the valley was definitely death, so I climbed. 3 hours later, I reached the first plateau, my hands raw and bleeding, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. When I looked back down into the valley, I could see a figure standing at the base of the cliff, looking up at me. Even from that distance, I could make out the white gleam of too many teeth. It took me 6 more hours to reach the top of the trail, and by then my water was gone and my legs were shaking with exhaustion. But I didn't stop moving until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I reached Hilo, where I checked into the first motel I could find and spent 3 days huddled in a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and other people's nightmares. I called the police on the 4th day, reported Brian missing, and told them we'd been separated during the hike. A search and rescue team went down into Waimanu Valley and found our campsite, but no trace of Brian. They said it looked like he'd simply vanished from his sleeping bag without taking any of his gear. They never found a body. The official report concluded that Brian had probably fallen from the cliff trail in the fog and been swept out to sea. Case closed. Next file, please. I flew back to the mainland 2 weeks later and never returned to Hawaii. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I get phone calls from numbers that don't exist. When I answer, I hear Brian's voice, but wrong, like someone playing a recording at the wrong speed. He tells me about the things he's learned in the deep places, about the hunger that lives in the dark spaces between the islands, about how much he misses me and wants me to come back so we can be together again. And sometimes, in the background of those calls, I hear other voices. voices of people who went hiking in remote places and never came back, all of them calling out names of friends and family who left them behind. The thing that took Brian is still down there, in the lava tubes that connect all the Hawaiian Islands like arteries in a vast body. It's patient and clever and always hungry for new secrets, new flesh, new fears to feed on. It wears the faces of people who trusted it enough to follow them into the dark, and it uses their voices to call others into the depths. I've researched missing persons reports from across the Pacific. The pattern is always the same. Friends or family members who go camping or hiking in remote locations. One person disappears, the other returns with stories about accidents or getting separated in bad weather. But if you look closely at the survivors' accounts, if you know what to look for, you can see the inconsistencies, the small details that don't quite match, the subtle wrongness that only someone who's seen the thing behind the mask would recognize. It's spreading, following the volcanic chains that connect all the Pacific Islands like a vast underwater nervous system. Last month, there was a missing person report from Samoa. Before that, Fiji. Always the same pattern, always the same impossible explanations. I know it will come for me eventually. Not the thing itself. I think it's bound to the volcanic region somehow, unable to leave the dark places where the Earth's blood flows closest to the surface. But it will send others, people it has taken and changed, people who walk on two legs and speak with human voices but smell like the spaces between worlds. I sleep with lights on in every room of my apartment now. I've installed deadbolts and security cameras and motion sensors, though I know none of it will matter when the time comes. You can't lock out something that already knows all your secrets, that can speak with the voices of people you trusted, that can wear faces you love. The worst part isn't the fear, though. It's the knowledge that I left Brian down there, that I abandoned my oldest friend to something worse than death because I was too scared to try to save him. In my rational moments, I know there was nothing I could have done, that going into that tunnel would have just given the creature 2 victims instead of 1. But in the dark hours before dawn, when the walls seem to close in and shadows move in ways that don't match any possible light source, I remember the sound of his voice calling my name from the deep places. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, there might have been another choice. The phone is ringing now. The caller ID shows a number from Hawaii, even though I changed my number 3 times and moved twice. When I answer, I know I'll hear Brian's voice asking me to come back, telling me how much he's learned in the darkness, promising me secrets that only the hungry things beneath the islands can teach. And someday, God help me, I think I might be weak enough to say yes. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote depths of Waipio Valley on Hawaii's Big Island, where the ancient gods still whisper through the wind and something far older than the volcanic rock hunts in the shadows. I should have listened to Kevin when he said we shouldn't go. My best friend since college had always been the cautious one, the voice of reason that kept us alive through our more reckless adventures. But I was desperate to escape the suffocating walls of my cubicle, the endless emails, the soul-crushing routine that had consumed the last 3 years of my life since graduation. The corporate world was slowly killing me, and I needed something real, something primal to remind me I was still alive. "Come on, Kev," I'd pleaded over beers at our usual dive bar. 2 weeks in Hawaii, hiking, camping, living off the land. When's the next time we'll get a chance like this? Kevin had stared into his beer, his dark eyes troubled. "I don't know, Mike. My grandmother always said there are places in Hawaii where the old spirits still walk, places where outsiders aren't welcome." I'd laughed it off then, called him superstitious. Kevin's Hawaiian grandmother had filled his childhood with stories of menehune, night marchers and shapeshifters that prowled the island's most sacred places. As a software engineer, Kevin was rational and logical, but some part of him had never fully shaken those childhood warnings. Now, 3 days into our backpacking trip through Waipio Valley, I was beginning to understand why his grandmother's stories had left such deep marks. The valley stretched out before us like a prehistoric wound in the earth, 7 miles long and a mile wide, carved by ancient waters and guarded by 1,000-foot cliffs that seemed to scrape the belly of the clouds. Waterfalls cascaded down those walls like tears, and the air hung thick with moisture that clung to our skin like desperate fingers. The trail we'd been following for the past 2 days had grown increasingly faint, until we were navigating by compass alone through dense groves of kukui trees and tangled ohia forests. "This doesn't feel right," Kevin muttered, adjusting his pack straps for the 100th time. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool shadows beneath the canopy. "We should have hit the stream by now." I checked my GPS unit, frowning at the flickering display. Signal's been spotty all morning, but according to the map, we're close. The map. We'd been using the same topographical map for 3 days, and I could have sworn the trail markings had been different yesterday. The path we'd taken to reach our current position didn't seem to exist on paper anymore, as if the valley itself was rewriting the rules of navigation. Kevin stopped walking entirely, his hand moving instinctively to the kukui nut lei his grandmother had given him before we left. "Mike, I think we should turn back." "We're not lost," I insisted, though my voice carried less conviction than I'd intended. "Look, there's a clearing up ahead. We'll make camp there, get our bearings in the morning." The clearing was wrong from the moment we stepped into it. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by trees that stood too straight, too uniform, like soldiers at attention. The grass grew in strange patterns, spiraling inward toward a dark patch of earth at the center where nothing grew at all. And the silence. God, the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to die at the tree line, leaving us in a bubble of unnatural quiet. "We're not camping here," Kevin said flatly. But exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead, and the thought of hiking another mile through the increasingly hostile terrain felt impossible. "It's just a clearing, Kev. Look, it's even got a natural fire ring." I pointed to the circle of black stones at the center of the dead patch. They were arranged too perfectly to be natural, worn smooth by countless hands and countless fires. Kevin stared at them with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, but something deeper and more primal. "Those aren't for camping fires," he whispered. I ignored him and started unpacking my gear. The rational part of my mind recognized that Kevin was spooked, probably by his grandmother's stories and the admittedly eerie atmosphere of the valley. But I was tired, my feet ached, and we needed shelter before the afternoon rains began. As I hammered in tent stakes, Kevin remained standing at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line with increasing agitation. "Mike, something's watching us." I looked up from my work, following his gaze into the shadows between the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shifting of darkness that didn't match the swaying branches. But when I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. "It's your imagination," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. We set up camp in tense silence, Kevin's discomfort radiating from him like heat. By the time our tents were erected and our gear secured, the sun had begun its descent toward the valley rim, painting the clearing in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to emphasize the wrongness of the place. I gathered wood for a fire while Kevin sat cross-legged in front of his tent, fingering his lei and muttering what sounded like prayers in Hawaiian. The language was foreign to me, but the tone was unmistakable. Placation, protection, desperate bargaining with forces beyond my understanding. The first match I struck went out immediately, despite the absence of wind. The second did the same. I tried again and again, growing increasingly frustrated as each flame died the moment it touched the kindling. "The wood's too damp," I muttered, though I knew that wasn't true. The branches I'd collected were dry and seasoned, perfect tinder that should have caught immediately. Kevin looked up from his prayers, his face pale in the dying light. "It doesn't want us here, Mike. It doesn't want fire in this place. It's just I started to protest, but the words died in my throat as I struck another match. This time, the flame not only caught but flared brilliantly, turning from orange to deep purple to an unsettling shade of green that cast our faces in sickly pallor. The fire crackled to life, but the flames danced in patterns that defied physics, reaching toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. Kevin scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror. We need to leave. Now. But night was falling fast in the valley, and the idea of navigating the treacherous terrain in darkness was more frightening than whatever had spooked my friend. We'll leave first thing in the morning, I promised. The fire will keep us safe until then. I was wrong about that, too. We ate our meager dinner in silence, neither of us willing to voice the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the world around us. The fire continued to burn in those impossible colors, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Kevin had stopped eating entirely, his food growing cold as he stared into the flames. My grandmother told me about places like this, he said suddenly. Places where the veil is thin, where things from the old world can still cross over. What kind of things? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Hunters, he whispered. Things that wear the faces of men but have forgotten what humanity means. They feed on more than flesh, Mike. They feed on the soul itself, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell that walks and talks but isn't really alive anymore. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the valley's cooling air. Those are just stories, Kev. Folklore to keep kids from wandering into dangerous places. Kevin's laugh was bitter and sharp. You think our ancestors were stupid? You think they made up stories about monsters just to scare children? Every legend has a root in truth, Mike. Every warning was written in blood. I wanted to argue, to cling to my rational worldview, but the words wouldn't come. The fire's unnatural flames painted Kevin's face in shifting patterns of light and shadow, and for a moment he looked like a stranger. Older, wiser, touched by knowledge I didn't want to possess. We retreated to our respective tents as full darkness settled over the clearing. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the absolute silence beyond the thin nylon walls, and tried to convince myself that everything would seem normal in the morning. Fear always felt worse in the dark. Logic and reason would return with the sun. I was drifting toward an uneasy sleep when I heard Kevin's tent zipper opening. "Mike," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mike, something's wrong with the fire." I crawled out of my tent and immediately understood what he meant. The flames had changed again, burning now with a cold, white light that seemed to pull warmth from the air rather than provide it. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The fire was growing. It had spread beyond the confines of the stone circle, consuming grass and earth that should have been too damp to burn. The flames moved with purpose, creating intricate patterns on the ground, symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways. "We have to get out of here," Kevin said, his voice tight with panic. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We began breaking down our camp with desperate efficiency, stuffing gear into packs without regard for organization. The fire continued to spread as we worked, its cold light making everything look like a photographic negative. That's when we heard the singing. It started as a low humming, barely audible above the crackling flames. But gradually it grew louder and more distinct, a wordless melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a longing so profound it made my chest ache. Kevin froze, his tent half-packed in his hands. "Don't listen to it," he whispered urgently. "Don't let it into your head." But the song was already there, winding through my thoughts like smoke, awakening memories I'd forgotten and desires I'd never acknowledged. I could see faces in the flames now, people I'd known, people I'd lost, people I'd never met but somehow loved, They were calling to me, beckoning me closer to the fire's embrace. I took a step toward the flames before Kevin grabbed my arm. "Mike, fight it!" His touch broke the spell, and suddenly I could think clearly again. The faces in the fire revealed themselves for what they truly were: distorted masks of flesh and shadow, neither fully human nor entirely other. Their mouths moved in unison with the singing, but their eyes held nothing but hunger. We finished packing in frantic silence and shouldered our packs. The fire had spread to encompass nearly half the clearing now, its cold flames reaching toward us like grasping hands. The singing grew louder, more insistent, joined now by other voices, dozens of them, hundreds, all calling us to join their eternal chorus. "The tree line," Kevin said, pointing toward a gap between two kukui trees. "If we can reach the forest, maybe we can break line of sight." We ran. The flames followed us, spreading across the ground with impossible speed. I could feel the cold burning at my heels, could hear the singing growing to a crescendo that threatened to shatter my sanity. The faces in the fire were reaching for us now, their elongated arms stretching beyond the bounds of physics to claw at our retreating forms. We plunged into the forest just as the flames reached the tree line. But instead of the safety I'd expected, we found only deeper darkness and a new kind of terror. The trees were moving, not swaying in the wind, actually moving, their roots pulling free from the earth with wet, sucking sounds as they repositioned themselves to block our path. Branches reached down like arthritic fingers, grasping for our hair and clothing. The very forest had become animate, hostile, determined to prevent our escape. We pushed deeper into the writhing wood, following what might have been a game trail or might have been our own desperate imagination. Behind us, the singing continued, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, multiple sets moving in perfect synchronization. "It's following us," Kevin panted, his voice ragged with exhaustion and fear. I glanced back and immediately wished I hadn't. The cold fire had entered the forest, moving between the trees like a living thing. And within its light, I could see shapes. Tall, gaunt figures with two long limbs and faces that shifted constantly between human and something else entirely. They moved with fluid grace, their feet barely touching the ground, their eyes fixed on us with predatory intensity. We ran harder, crashing through underbrush that seemed to reach for us with thorny fingers. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but terror drove me forward. Kevin was beside me, his grandmother's lei bouncing against his chest as he ran. The forest began to thin, and ahead I could see the faint gleam of water, the stream we'd been searching for earlier. If we could reach it, if we could put running water between us and our pursuers, maybe we'd have a chance. "The stream!" I gasped, pointing toward the silvery ribbon ahead. We burst from the tree line and found ourselves on the bank of a wide, fast-flowing creek. Without hesitation, Kevin plunged into the water, and I followed. The current was stronger than expected, the water ice-cold against our skin. But it was real, natural, untainted by whatever malevolent force had claimed the clearing. Behind us, the singing stopped abruptly. I turned to look back and saw them standing at the forest's edge, the tall, shifting figures silhouetted against the cold fire's glow. They seemed reluctant to approach the water, their forms wavering like heat mirages. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then one of them stepped forward and I could see its face clearly for the first time. It wore Kevin's features like an ill-fitting mask, the familiar lines and angles distorted just enough to fall into the uncanny valley. But the eyes were completely wrong, ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "Kev," it called, its voice a perfect mimicry of my friend's tone. "Where you going, bro? The party's just getting started." I looked at my friend, expecting to see his horror at this grotesque impersonation. Instead, I found Kevin staring at the creature with an expression I couldn't read. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "Kevin," I whispered. He turned to me, and for just a moment, His eyes held the same ancient hunger I'd seen in the thing wearing his face. Then he blinked, and he was my friend again, frightened and confused. I can't remember," he stammered, his hand moving to his lei. The creature on the bank laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You're starting to remember, aren't you? Starting to understand what you really are." More figures emerged from the forest, each wearing familiar faces. My co-workers, my family, even my own features grinned back at me from one of the approaching forms. They spread out along the bank, surrounding us. "The water won't protect you forever," my doppelganger said. "And your friend knows the truth now. Don't you, Kevin?" Kevin's grip on his lei tightened, his knuckles white with strain. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "My grandmother wasn't just Hawaiian. She was something else, something older. That's why she knew the stories, why she could speak to the old spirits." The pieces clicked together in my mind with horrible clarity. Kevin. "I never knew," he continued, his words coming faster now. "I thought I was just human, just normal. But being here, in this place, it's waking something up inside me, something that's been sleeping my whole life." The creatures on the bank began to advance, stepping into the stream with casual disregard for the running water that had seemed to repel them moments before. They moved slowly, savoring our terror, certain of their victory. "You have a choice," the Kevin thing said. "Join us willingly, and the transformation will be gentle. Fight, and we'll make it last for days." I looked at my friend, my real friend, and saw the battle raging behind his eyes. Part of him was fighting the awakening darkness, clinging to his humanity with desperate strength. But another part, something deeper and more primal, was responding to the call of his ancient heritage. "I'm sorry, Mike," he whispered, and I saw his hand move toward the knife on his belt. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed Kevin's wrist before he could draw the blade, then wrapped my other arm around his waist and threw us both backward into the deeper part of the stream. The current caught us immediately, dragging us downstream toward the distant roar of rapids. Behind us, the creatures howled in fury, their voices joining in a chorus of rage and frustration. But they didn't follow us into the water. Whatever force governed their existence, whatever rules bound them to the land, they couldn't pursue us here. The stream carried us through a series of increasingly violent rapids, bouncing us off rocks and submerged logs like rag dolls. I managed to keep hold of Kevin despite his struggles, though I couldn't tell if he was fighting the current or fighting me. The cold water was numbing my limbs, making it harder to maintain my grip with each passing second. We tumbled over a small waterfall and crashed into a deep pool below. The impact drove the air from my lungs, and for a moment I thought I was going to drown. But somehow I managed to haul both Kevin and myself to the rocky shore. We lay gasping on the wet stones, our gear scattered and waterlogged, our bodies battered and hypothermic. But we were alive, and more importantly, we were away from that cursed clearing and its inhuman inhabitants. Kevin was the first to speak, his voice weak and shaky. "Thank you," he whispered. I could feel it trying to take over, trying to make me into something else. I helped him sit up, checking for serious injuries. Aside from cuts and bruises, we both seemed intact. "Your grandmother's lei," I said, noticing that the kukui nuts were still around his neck despite our violent journey downstream. "It protected you, didn't it?" He nodded, his fingers tracing the ancient beads. "She made me promise to wear it the whole trip, said it would keep the old blood from awakening." He laughed bitterly. "I thought she was just being superstitious." We spent the rest of the night huddled together for warmth, taking turns keeping watch. Neither of us slept. Every shadow seemed to hide predatory shapes, every sound made us flinch. But as dawn broke over the valley rim, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. "We need to get out of here," Kevin said as the first rays of sunlight touched the water, "before they find another way to reach us." We salvaged what we could from our scattered gear and began the long trek toward the valley mouth. The trail seemed clearer now, as if the valley itself was eager to be rid of us. Or perhaps the morning sun had restored the natural order, pushing back the darkness that ruled the night hours. It took us 6 hours to reach the parking area where we'd left Kevin's truck. The vehicle looked impossibly normal, impossibly safe, a relic from a world where monsters existed only in movies and nightmares. I'd never been so happy to see rusted metal and cracked vinyl seats. As we drove away from Waipio Valley, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see tall figures emerging from the forest to pursue us. But the road remained empty, and gradually, the terrible tension in my chest began to ease. "We can't tell anyone about this," Kevin said as we reached the main highway. "They'd think we were crazy." I nodded, understanding the weight of the secret we'd have to carry. Who would believe us? Who would accept that ancient things still walked the remote places of the world, wearing human faces and singing songs of hunger and despair? But even as I agreed to Kevin's request for silence, I knew I couldn't simply forget what we'd experienced. The memory of those shifting faces, that impossible fire, the sound of my friend's voice calling me to join the eternal hunt. It would stay with me forever. Kevin returned to his software engineering job, and I went back to my corporate cubicle. On the surface, nothing had changed. We met for beers at our usual dive bar, talked about mundane things, pretended that our world hadn't been fundamentally altered by 3 days in a Hawaiian valley. But sometimes, late at night, I would catch Kevin staring at nothing with those same ancient eyes I'd seen by the stream. And sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, he would touch his grandmother's lei and whisper prayers in a language that predated human civilization. The official story was that we'd gotten lost in Waipio Valley and had to be rescued by helicopter after our emergency beacon was activated. The rescue team found no trace of our campsite, no evidence of the supernatural fire or the creatures that had hunted us. According to them, we'd wandered in circles for 3 days before finally triggering our distress signal. I let them believe their version of events. It was safer that way. But I knew the truth. I knew that there were places in this world where the veil between realities grew thin, where ancient hungers still prowled in the shadows. And I knew that Kevin carried something inside him now, something that his grandmother's protective magic was barely strong enough to contain. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I wonder how long that protection will last. I wonder if the things in Waipio Valley are still singing their hypnotic songs, still waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain. And I wonder if Kevin's struggle against his awakening heritage will end in victory or surrender. The rational part of my mind insists it was all hallucination, stress, dehydration, and an overactive imagination combining to create a shared delusion. But late at night, when sleep eludes me and shadows seem to move with purpose, I remember the taste of that impossible fire and the sound of my own voice calling to me from the darkness. And I know that some hungers are patient enough to wait lifetimes for their prey to return. 3 months after our return from Hawaii, Kevin disappeared. I'd noticed changes in him over the preceding weeks, subtle alterations in his behavior that only someone who'd known him for years would recognize. He'd stopped eating meat entirely, claiming it made him nauseous. He'd taken to working night shifts, saying the daylight gave him headaches. And his eyes had begun to reflect light like an animal's. The police found his truck abandoned at the trailhead to Waipio Valley. His grandmother's lei was discovered on the driver's seat, the kukui nuts cracked and blackened as if they'd been exposed to intense heat. There was no sign of Kevin himself. The search and rescue teams combed the valley for weeks, but found nothing. Eventually, they declared him dead, another victim of Hawaii's dangerous wilderness areas. His family held a memorial service, and his coworkers sent flowers to an empty grave. But I know better. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, I find myself standing at my window, looking west toward Hawaii. And sometimes, carried on winds that shouldn't exist, I hear singing, wordless melodies filled with ancient hunger and timeless patience. The voice is Kevin's now, but it carries harmonies that predate human language. It calls to me across the vast Pacific, promising reunion, promising transformation, promising an end to the loneliness that has consumed me since I returned to my mundane existence. I've thrown away the business cards for Hawaiian vacation packages that keep appearing in my mailbox. I've changed my phone number 3 times to stop the calls that come in the small hours, where familiar voices whisper invitations to return to the valley. I've even considered moving to the East Coast, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the place that claimed my friend. But the singing follows me everywhere now. It's in the wind, through city streets, in the hum of fluorescent lights, in the whispered conversations of strangers on subway platforms. The melody has become part of the world's background noise, always present, always patient, always calling me home. I know I can't resist forever. The rational defenses I've built around my sanity are crumbling, piece by piece, note by note. Soon, I'll find myself booking a flight to Honolulu, driving a rental car to Waipio Valley, walking alone into the forest where ancient things wait with patient hunger. And when that day comes, when I finally answer the call that has been growing stronger every night since our escape, I wonder if I'll have the strength to resist the transformation. Or if I'll join Kevin and the others in their eternal hunt, adding my voice to the chorus that sings travelers to their doom. The fire burns cold in Waipio Valley, and its light never dies. It's waiting for me. We're all waiting. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Waimanu Valley on Hawaii's Big Island, a place so remote that most locals warned us against going there alone. Sarah and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. She was 26, an environmental science graduate student researching native Hawaiian ecosystems, and I was a software developer desperate for a break from screens and code. We'd been together for 3 years, and this trip was supposed to be our chance to reconnect away from the digital noise of modern life. The Waimanu Valley Trail is notoriously difficult, a grueling 8-mile hike through dense rainforest that descends nearly 2,000 feet to a black sand beach accessible only by foot. The trailhead sits beyond Waipio Valley, itself already isolated enough that rental car companies void your insurance for driving there. But Sarah had secured research permits, and we were both experienced hikers. What could go wrong? We started our descent at dawn on a Tuesday in October. The morning air was thick with humidity and the earthy smell of decomposing vegetation. Ancient ohia trees towered above us, their gnarled branches creating a canopy so dense that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The trail was muddy from recent rains, forcing us to grip exposed roots and rocks to maintain our footing on the steep descent. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, stopping to photograph a rare native bird flitting between the branches. Her long auburn hair was already damp with sweat and mist, curling at the edges beneath her hiking cap. The biodiversity here is off the charts. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand, tasting salt. "How much further to the bottom?" "About 4 more miles of this," she said, shouldering her pack. "But trust me, it's worth it. Waimanu is one of the most pristine valleys in Hawaii. Hardly anyone makes it down here." We continued our descent, the trail growing narrower and more treacherous. Massive ferns unfurled like prehistoric umbrellas, and the sound of distant waterfalls echoed through the valley. But something felt wrong. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, just a nagging sensation that we were being watched. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping suddenly. Sarah looked back at me, eyebrows raised. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, listening to the symphony of the rainforest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant crash of waves against the shore below. But underneath it all, I could have sworn I heard something else, a low humming, almost like chanting. "Probably just the wind through the trees," Sarah said, but I noticed she glanced around nervously before continuing down the trail. 3 hours into our hike, we reached a small clearing where someone had built a makeshift shelter from fallen branches and palm fronds. It looked recently abandoned. Fresh-cut vegetation, no moss growing on the structure. A circle of stones surrounded cold ashes from a fire. "That's weird," Sarah said, kneeling beside the fire pit. "This place is supposed to be uninhabited." I examined the shelter more closely. Personal items were scattered around, a rusted can opener, some rotting food scraps, and, strangest of all, what looked like small animal bones arranged in deliberate patterns around the perimeter of the camp. "Maybe someone else got permits?" I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. Sarah had told me the waiting list for research permits was months long, and recreational camping wasn't allowed in this protected area. We decided to push on, eager to reach our designated campsite before dark, but the discovery of the shelter had unsettled us both. We hiked in relative silence, our previous excitement replaced by a growing unease. The trail became even more challenging as we descended. In several places, we had to use ropes left by previous hikers to rappel down near vertical rock faces. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack and my knees screamed with each jarring step. But it was the psychological weight that bothered me most, the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. "Mike, look at this," Sarah called from ahead. I caught up to find her standing at the edge of a stream crossing. The water ran dark red, like blood. "Iron deposits," she explained, but her voice was tight. "Totally natural. The volcanic soil here is rich in minerals." I knelt and cupped some of the water in my hands. It smelled metallic and wrong, nothing like the clean mountain streams I was used to from hiking in Colorado. When I looked up, Sarah was staring at something behind me. "There's someone watching us," she whispered. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing except the dense wall of vegetation. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, even the wind had died. "Where?" I thought I saw someone. "Up there, between those trees." She pointed with a shaking finger toward a cluster of massive koa trees about 50 yards uphill from us. "But they're gone now." We stood frozen for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned. Birds resumed their calls. Leaves rustled in the breeze. But something had changed. The very air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. "Let's keep moving," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We need to reach the beach before sunset." The final descent to Waimanu Beach was the most treacherous yet. The trail zigzagged down a cliff face so steep that one wrong step would send us tumbling hundreds of feet into the valley below. My hands were raw from gripping rocks and roots, and my legs trembled with exhaustion. But when we finally emerged from the forest onto the black sand beach, the view took my breath away. The valley opened like a massive green amphitheater, with waterfalls cascading down cliffs that rose nearly vertical on 3 sides. The beach stretched for maybe a mile, empty except for driftwood and the occasional monk seal basking in the late afternoon sun. "This is it," Sarah said, her excitement returning despite our unsettling journey. "Our home for the next 4 days." We set up camp near a grove of coconut palms, about a quarter mile from where the trail emerged onto the beach. The spot offered some protection from wind and rain, with fresh water available from a stream that tumbled down the cliff face behind us. As I struggled to set up our tent in the soft sand, Sarah collected water and began preparing dinner on our camp stove. The familiar domestic routine helped calm my nerves. Maybe I'd been letting my imagination run wild. Maybe the isolation was just getting to me. "This mac and cheese is terrible," Sarah laughed, taking a bite of our rehydrated dinner as the sun set behind the cliffs. "But somehow it tastes amazing out here." I managed a smile, forcing myself to relax. We were in one of the most beautiful places on Earth, completely alone with the woman I loved. This was supposed to be romantic, not terrifying. But as darkness fell, my anxiety returned. The night sounds of the tropical forest were nothing like what I was used to. Strange calls and rustling that seemed too large to be birds or small animals. Our campfire cast dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes, making me see movement where there was none. "Did you bring the satellite communicator?" I asked as we settled into our sleeping bags. "Of course," Sarah replied, "but the battery's dead. I forgot to charge it before we left." My blood went cold. "What do you mean it's dead?" "I checked it earlier when we stopped for lunch. Must have been draining power sitting in my pack. But don't worry, we're only here for 4 days, and you said yourself that your phone had signal at the trailhead." I pulled out my phone to check. No signal, and the battery was at 30% despite being fully charged that morning. "That's impossible. I barely used it today." Sarah frowned and checked her own phone. "Mine's almost dead too. That's really weird." We tried to dismiss it as some quirk of the tropical environment. Maybe the humidity was affecting the electronics. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was actively draining our devices, cutting off our connection to the outside world. Sleep came fitfully that first night. Every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by sounds I couldn't identify. Footsteps in the sand, whispered voices just beyond the edge of hearing. At one point, I was certain I heard someone calling my name from the direction of the waterfall, but when I unzipped the tent to look, there was nothing but darkness. "Mike," Sarah whispered beside me. "Are you awake?" "Yeah. Can't sleep either?" "There's something out there. I keep hearing. I don't know what to call it, like singing, but not quite human." I strained my ears and heard it too. A low, melodic humming that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was beautiful and terrifying, like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human. "Should we investigate?" I asked, though every instinct screamed against leaving the false security of our tent. "No," Sarah said firmly. "Absolutely not. Whatever it is, we stay here until daylight." The singing continued for hours, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers. Occasionally, I thought I could make out words in what might have been Hawaiian, but the meaning eluded me. Finally, sometime after midnight, it stopped altogether, and exhaustion overtook my fear. I woke to sunlight filtering through the tent walls and the sound of Sarah moving around outside. For a moment, I felt relief. The previous night's terrors seemed like products of an overactive imagination in the harsh light of day. "Morning, sleepyhead," Sarah called as I emerged from the tent. She was crouched by the stream, filling our water bottles. "Sleep better after the singing stopped?" "You heard it too, then. I was starting to think I was losing my mind." "Probably just some nightbirds," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't really believe it. "Local species I'm not familiar with." I looked around our campsite and froze. Our food bag, which we had carefully hung from a tree branch the night before, was on the ground. Not torn or chewed by animals, simply untied and placed gently on the sand. "Sarah," I called, my voice tight, "did you take down the food bag?" She looked up from the stream, following my gaze. "No, I haven't touched it since last night." We approached the bag together. Nothing was missing, but everything had been carefully removed and then repacked. Our trail mix was in perfectly sorted piles, nuts in one group, dried fruit in another, chocolate chips in a third. Our energy bars were stacked in precise pyramids. "Animals don't do this," Sarah whispered. "No," I agreed, "they don't." That's when I noticed the footprints, bare human feet, smaller than mine but larger than Sarah's, leading from our camp toward the waterfall and then back again. The prints were deep and perfectly formed in the wet sand, as if someone had been walking very slowly and deliberately. "We should leave," I said. "Right now." Sarah was staring at the footprints, her face pale. "We can't. The research data I need to collect, my thesis depends on it. And besides, it's an 8-hour hike back to the car. We'd never make it before dark." She was right, but every nerve in my body was screaming danger. Something was very wrong in this valley, and we were trapped here for at least another night. We spent the day exploring the beach and nearby streams, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Sarah collected plant samples and took detailed notes, throwing herself into her work with the intensity she always displayed when stressed. I tried to help, but my attention kept drifting to the tree line, watching for any sign of movement. The second night was worse. The singing started earlier this time, just as the sun disappeared behind the western cliffs. But now there were voices, multiple singers creating an eerie harmony that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the valley. The melody was hypnotic, almost pulling me toward the sound. "Don't listen to it," Sarah said, grabbing my arm as I started to stand. "Something's not right about that music." But I could feel it working on my mind, making the rational part of my brain go quiet. The voices were so beautiful, so compelling. They seemed to be calling specifically to me, promising answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking. "I have to see what it is," I mumbled, standing despite Sarah's grip on my arm. "Mike, no!" She tackled me, knocking me back down onto our sleeping bags. "Look at yourself. Your eyes are completely dilated. That singing is doing something to you." The physical contact seemed to break whatever spell the music was weaving. I blinked hard, and the compulsion faded. But I could still hear the voices, and now they sounded angry, frustrated that their call had been resisted. We spent the night huddled together in the tent, Sarah's arms wrapped around me, both of us fighting the urge to follow the singing into the darkness. At one point, I swear I saw shadows moving past our tent, tall, thin figures that walked with an odd, stilted gait. "Traditional Hawaiian folklore talks about night marchers," Sarah whispered. "Spirits of ancient warriors. But this feels different. Older." Dawn brought relief and a terrible discovery. Sarah was gone. I woke alone in the tent, my arms still wrapped around empty space where she had been. Her sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, suggesting she had left voluntarily. But Sarah would never have gone anywhere without waking me, especially not after the previous night's events. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the valley walls. "Sarah, where are you?" No response except the mocking cry of seabirds and the crash of waves against the shore. I searched frantically around our campsite, finding her footprints leading toward the waterfall where we had first heard the singing. The tracks were clear in the wet sand. She had been walking normally at first, but gradually they became wider spaced, as if she had been running towards something. The trail led to the base of the largest waterfall, where it simply stopped. The pool was deep and dark, fed by water cascading from hundreds of feet above. I called her name until my throat was raw, but the only sounds that came back were echoes and the roar of falling water. That's when I saw her. Sarah was standing on a ledge behind the waterfall, about 30 feet up the cliff face. She was perfectly still, facing away from me, wearing only her underwear. Her discarded clothes lay in a neat pile beside the pool. "Sarah!" I screamed. "What are you doing up there?" She turned slowly, too slowly, like a marionette being manipulated by inexpert hands. When she faced me, I saw that her eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just blank whiteness that seemed to glow in the shadows behind the falling water. She smiled then, but it wasn't Sarah's smile. It was too wide, stretching her face in ways that looked painful. And when she opened her mouth, the sound that came out wasn't her voice. It was the same melodic humming we had heard for the past 2 nights, emanating from her throat in harmonies that no human vocal cords could produce. "Come up," she called, and her voice was Sarah's again, normal and loving. "The water's perfect for swimming. You have to see this." Every instinct told me not to trust what I was seeing, but it was Sarah's face, Sarah's voice. Maybe she had hit her head or was suffering from some kind of altitude sickness. I had to help her. I began climbing the cliff face beside the waterfall, using handholds carved into the rock by centuries of erosion. The stone was slippery with spray, and more than once I nearly lost my grip. But I kept climbing, driven by desperation to reach the woman I loved. "That's it," Sarah encouraged from above. "Almost there." But as I climbed higher, I began to notice details that turned my blood to ice. Sarah's skin looked wrong, too pale, with dark veins visible beneath the surface like a roadmap of corruption. Her hair hung limp and lifeless, and when she moved, her limbs bent at angles that suggested her joints no longer worked the way they should. When I was about 20 feet from the ledge, she spoke again. "I've been waiting for you, Michael," she said, and this time there was no mistaking that the voice wasn't quite right. The tone was Sarah's, but the cadence was off, like someone doing an imperfect impression. "The others told me you would come?" "Others?" I gasped, my arms burning from the climb. "The ones who live in the deep places, the ones who remember when this valley ran red with sacrifice." Her white eyes seemed to track something I couldn't see. "They're so hungry, Michael, and you're going to help feed them." That's when I understood. Whatever was standing on that ledge wasn't Sarah anymore. Something had taken her form, inhabited her body, and was using her voice to lure me to my death. I began climbing down as fast as I dared, but the thing wearing Sarah's face let out a shriek of rage that made my ears ring. The sound echoed off the valley walls, multiplying and distorting until it sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. My hands slipped on the wet rock and I fell the last 10 feet, landing hard on my back beside the pool. Pain shot through my ribs and I tasted blood, but I was alive, and I was away from whatever had taken Sarah. I looked up to see the Sarah thing perched on the edge of the ledge, no longer bothering to maintain its human pretense. Its limbs were elongated now, fingers stretching into claws that gouged marks in the stone. Its face was a shifting mask of features, sometimes Sarah's, sometimes something reptilian, sometimes just a smooth expanse of pale flesh with those horrible white eyes. "You can't leave, Michael," it called, its voice now a layered harmony of tones. "The valley won't let you. We won't let you." I ran. I sprinted back to our campsite, threw my most essential gear into my pack and started toward the trail that led back up to the rim of the valley. But when I reached the spot where the path should have begun its steep ascent, I found only solid cliff face. The trail was gone, as if it had never existed. Panic rising in my throat, I searched along the entire back wall of the valley. There had to be a way out. We hadn't imagined hiking down here, but every possible exit was blocked by vertical stone that rose hundreds of feet to the rim above. I was trapped. As evening approached, I made camp on the far end of the beach as far from the waterfall as possible. I didn't dare start a fire. The last thing I wanted was to attract whatever was pretending to be Sarah. Instead, I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my camping knife and trying to come up with a plan. The singing started again at sunset, but this time it was different. Instead of the haunting melodies of the previous nights, the voices were discordant, angry, and underneath the cacophony, I could hear Sarah's voice, the real Sarah, screaming for help. She was still alive, somewhere in this valley. The thing I had seen at the waterfall was wearing her form, but the real Sarah was trapped, imprisoned by whatever ancient evil inhabited this place. I had to find her. Against every survival instinct, I left my hiding spot and began searching the valley. I moved carefully, using the moon's light to navigate, staying close to the cliff walls where the shadows were deepest. The singing followed me wherever I went, sometimes loud and threatening, sometimes dropping to a whisper that made me strain to hear. Near the center of the valley, I found what I was looking for, a crack in the cliff face that opened into a cave system. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it exhaled a smell of decay and old death that made my stomach clench. Sarah's screams were coming from inside. I forced myself through the opening, my headlamp beam revealing a tunnel that descended into the heart of the cliff. The walls were covered in some kind of primitive artwork, figures dancing around fires, human forms being torn apart by creatures with too many limbs, and symbols that hurt to look at directly. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow. The source of the light was a pool of water in the center of the cave, its surface covered with some kind of luminescent algae. And floating in that pool, unconscious but breathing, was Sarah. But she wasn't alone. Around the edges of the chamber, dozens of figures sat in perfect stillness. At first, I thought they were statues, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were people. Or had been people once. Their bodies were pale and emaciated. Their eyes the same blank white I had seen in the Seraphing's face. They were all staring at the pool, unblinking, like worshippers frozen in eternal devotion. Some of the bodies were fresh, their clothes still intact. Others were so old that only bones remained, held together by dried sinew and scraps of ancient fabric. But all of them had the same expression of peaceful emptiness, as if whatever they had been before had been scooped out and replaced with nothing. I stepped into the chamber, and every head turned toward me in perfect unison. The sound of bones creaking and joints popping filled the air as dozens of mouths opened to release that haunting harmony we had been hearing. But I only had eyes for Sarah. She was alive, floating face up in the glowing water, her chest rising and falling steadily. I had to reach her, had to get her out of there before whatever had taken the others claimed her too. I waded into the pool, the water surprisingly warm against my legs. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I felt that same compulsion I had experienced on our first night, the urge to stop moving, to join the watchers around the pool's edge, to let whatever lived in this place take away all my fear and pain and responsibility. "No," I whispered, forcing myself to keep moving. "Not today." I reached Sarah and pulled her against me, her body limp and unresponsive. She was breathing, but her skin was cold despite the warm water. When I lifted her eyelids, I saw her pupils were dilated to pinpoints. "Sarah," I whispered, "can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered, and for a moment I saw recognition there. "Mike," she breathed. Where are we?" "We're getting out of here," I said, half carrying her toward the cave entrance, but the watchers were moving now, standing with jerky, unnatural motions. They began walking toward us, their feet splashing in the shallow water at the pool's edge. Their faces were blank, emotionless, but their hands were reaching for us with obvious intent. I pulled out my camping knife, holding it in front of me as I backed toward the tunnel with Sarah in my arms. "Stay away from us." The nearest figure, a middle-aged man in a rotting Aloha shirt, opened his mouth and released a sound like steam escaping from a radiator. Others joined in, creating a hissing chorus that made my teeth ache. That's when I noticed the symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't just random artwork. They were part of a pattern, a complex design that spiraled around the entire room. And, at certain points in the pattern, I could see bones embedded in the stone. Human bones, arranged to complete sections of the design. This wasn't just a cave, it was a trap, a prison designed to hold something that should never have been released. And we had stumbled into the middle of whatever ritual had been taking place here for centuries. I reached the tunnel entrance with Sarah just as the first of the watchers reached us. Cold fingers grabbed at my shirt, my pack, trying to pull us back into the chamber. I slashed with my knife, feeling it connect with something soft and yielding. Black ichor splashed across the tunnel wall, and the creature let out a shriek of rage. We ran. I half-carried, half-dragged Sarah through the tunnel as the screaming behind us grew to a deafening pitch. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with fury, and chunks of stone began falling from the ceiling. We burst out of the crack in the cliff face just as the tunnel collapsed behind us, sealing the chamber and its contents inside. "The trail," Sarah gasped, her voice weak but lucid. "There's another way out. The old Hawaiian path on the north side of the valley." She was right. In our panic and terror, we had been looking for the obvious modern trail. But before European contact, Hawaiians had accessed this valley by a different route, a steep but manageable path that was hidden by vegetation and time. We found it just as the sun began to rise, a narrow track that zigzagged up the cliff face through dense ferns and native plants. It was treacherous, barely more than handholds and footholds carved into the rock, but it was passable. The climb took 6 hours. My ribs screamed with pain from my fall at the waterfall, and Sarah was weak from whatever the things in the cave had done to her. But we kept climbing, driven by the knowledge that staying in the valley meant joining those silent watchers in their eternal vigil. We reached the rim of the valley just as the afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward the western horizon. From the top, Waimanu looked like paradise, a perfect tropical amphitheater where waterfalls cascaded into pristine pools and native birds called from ancient trees. It was only when you got closer that you discovered the truth. "We have to report this," I said as we stumbled toward the parking area where we had left our rental car. "The authorities need to know what's down there." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Report what, exactly?" she finally asked. "That we found some old bones in a cave? That we hallucinated supernatural encounters because of dehydration and stress?" I started to protest, but she continued. "Mike, look at us. We're filthy, exhausted, and probably in shock. If we go to the police talking about possessed bodies and underground chambers full of zombies, they're going to think we had psychotic breaks." She was right, of course. Who would believe our story? And even if they did, what could anyone do? The cave was sealed now, buried under tons of rock. The things trapped inside would remain trapped, at least until the next curious hikers stumbled into their web. "Besides," Sarah added quietly, "I don't think those things were evil exactly. I think they were hungry, lonely. They've been trapped in that valley for so long that they've forgotten what it means to be human. They just want company." I stared at her, alarmed by the sympathy in her voice. "Sarah, they tried to kill us. Did they? Or were they trying to save us from something worse?" She touched my arm and her skin was still cold despite the warm afternoon sun. "I remember some of what happened while I was away. The pool, the singing. It was peaceful, Mike. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we shouldn't be so quick to judge something we don't understand." Her eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of that blank whiteness I had seen in the cave. But then she blinked, and her eyes were normal brown again. "Come on," she said with her familiar smile. "Let's go home." We drove back to Hilo in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. Sarah dozed against the passenger window while I navigated the winding mountain roads, and in the growing darkness, I found myself listening for familiar melodies in the wind. 3 weeks later, back in our apartment in Seattle, I woke from a nightmare about singing voices and glowing pools to find Sarah's side of the bed empty. I searched the apartment but couldn't find her anywhere. Her car was still in the parking garage, her purse and phone were on the kitchen counter, but she was simply gone. I filed a missing person report, but the police found no evidence of foul play. Sarah had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a note tucked inside my hiking boots. "The valley calls, and I must answer. Don't try to find me. Remember me as I was, not as I'm becoming. S." I threw the note away immediately, but I can still recite it word for word. And sometimes, late at night when the apartment is quiet, I hear singing in the distance. Beautiful, haunting melodies that make me want to pack my bags and book a flight to Hawaii. I've changed jobs twice since then, moved to a different city, even tried dating other women. But nothing helps. The music follows me wherever I go, growing stronger each day. And every night I dream of a glowing pool surrounded by peaceful watchers waiting patiently for me to join them. Sarah was right about one thing. The valley does call. And I'm starting to understand that some calls are impossible to resist forever. I've already bought my plane ticket. My name is William Brown, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Waimanu Valley on the Big Island of Hawaii, a place so isolated that most tourists never even hear its name whispered in guidebooks. Jennifer and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. She was 26, worked as a graphic designer back in Portland, and had this infectious laugh that could light up any room. We'd been together for 3 years, and I was carrying an engagement ring in my pack, waiting for the perfect moment beneath Hawaii's starlit sky. The Waimanu Valley seemed ideal. A 7-mile hike through dense rainforest to reach a pristine black sand beach where waterfalls cascaded directly into the Pacific. Paradise, they called it. We should have listened to the warnings. The elderly Hawaiian man at the gas station in Waipio had grabbed my wrist when I mentioned our destination. His weathered fingers felt like dried leather against my skin, and his eyes held a depth of knowledge that made me uncomfortable. "Waimanu Valley hungry place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Spirits there no like visitors. You go different place, yeah?" Jennifer laughed it off, charmed by what she called local folklore. I wanted to believe it was harmless superstition, too, but something in the old man's expression stayed with me as we loaded our packs with 5 days' worth of supplies. The trailhead began innocuously enough, well-maintained wooden signs and a clearly marked path through thick ohia trees. Jennifer walked ahead, her blonde ponytail bouncing with each step, occasionally turning back to snap photos of me, trudging behind with our heavier gear. The canopy above filtered the morning sunlight into dancing green patterns, and the air smelled of rich earth and tropical flowers. "This is incredible," she called back, stopping to photograph a massive tree fern. "We're going to have the most amazing story to tell everyone back home." For the first few hours, everything felt normal. We crossed several streams, navigated some muddy sections, and stopped for lunch beside a small waterfall. Jennifer's excitement was contagious, and I found myself forgetting the old man's warning. This was just another adventure for us. We'd hiked portions of the Pacific Crest Trail, camped in Glacier National Park, and spent a week in the Boundary Waters. We knew what we were doing. But as we descended deeper into the valley, subtle changes began to creep in. The bird sounds that had accompanied us all morning gradually faded to silence. The temperature dropped despite the afternoon sun, and a persistent mist began to curl around the tree trunks. Most unsettling was how the trail itself seemed to shift. Markers I remembered passing on our left appeared on our right when I glanced back. Distances felt wrong. Sections that should have taken 20 minutes stretched into an hour. "Will, do you think we took a wrong turn somewhere?" Jennifer asked during our afternoon break. She was studying our map, her brow furrowed with concern. "According to this, we should have reached the overlook by now." I checked my GPS device, but the screen showed only static. "Battery must be dying," I muttered, though I'd charged it fully the night before. "Don't worry, we just need to keep following the trail downhill. It has to lead to the valley floor eventually." Jennifer nodded, but I caught her glancing nervously at the shadows between the trees. The mist was thickening, and visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet in any direction. Every step forward felt like pushing through an invisible membrane of resistance. We set up camp that evening beside what appeared to be the main trail, though neither of us felt entirely confident about our location. The clearing was perfectly circular, which should have been our first real warning. Nature doesn't create perfect circles. As we erected our tent, I noticed that no plants grew within the ring, just bare, dark earth that felt unnaturally cold beneath our feet. "At least we'll have a good view of the stars," Jennifer said, forcing optimism into her voice as she prepared our dinner on the camp stove. But when darkness fell, no stars appeared. The canopy above was too thick, and the mist had become so dense it seemed to swallow our flashlight beams after just a few feet. That's when we heard the first sound. It started as a low humming, almost subsonic, vibrating through the ground and up into our bones. Jennifer grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh. "What is that?" she whispered. I listened intently, trying to identify the source. It wasn't wind. The air was completely still. It wasn't any animal sound I recognized. The humming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling in rhythms that hurt to follow. Probably just wind in the valley, I said, though I didn't believe it myself. These tropical valleys can create weird acoustic effects. The humming continued for nearly an hour before fading away, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt oppressive. We zipped ourselves into our tent and tried to sleep, but every small sound, Jennifer's breathing, the rustle of our sleeping bags, my own heartbeat, seemed amplified in the unnatural quiet. I must have dozed off eventually because I was awakened by Jennifer shaking me violently. "Will, wake up! Someone's out there!" I fumbled for my flashlight and checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Outside our tent, footsteps circled our campsite, slow, deliberate, with an odd dragging quality that made the hair on my neck stand up. But the footsteps were too heavy to be human, and they followed no logical pattern. They would approach our tent, stop for long minutes, then retreat only to circle back from a different direction. "Should we call out?" Jennifer whispered. I pressed my finger to her lips, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it to know we were awake. The footsteps continued until dawn, never quite close enough for us to see what made them, but close enough that we could hear the wet, squelching sound they made in the damp earth. When the first gray light filtered through our tent walls, the sounds finally stopped. We packed up quickly and in silence, both of us eager to reach the valley floor and put some distance between ourselves and that clearing. But as we folded our tent, Jennifer made a discovery that chilled us both. "Will, look at this." Around our campsite, pressed deep into the soft earth, were footprints. But they weren't human. Each print was roughly the size of a dinner plate, elongated with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. Most disturbing of all, they formed a perfect circle around where our tent had been, with no trail leading in or out of the ring. "We need to leave," Jennifer said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Right now." I wanted to agree, but when I checked our supplies, I discovered our first real problem. Our water bottles, which I'd filled from the stream the previous afternoon, now contained a thick, dark liquid that smelled of rotting vegetation. Our food packages had been opened, not torn or chewed, but carefully unsealed and resealed, the contents missing. "Something got into our packs," I told Jennifer, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We need to find water and figure out our food situation." Jennifer's face went pale. "How is that possible? I would have heard something opening zippers moving around our stuff." I had no answer. The zippers on our packs showed no signs of damage, and we'd slept with everything inside our tent. Yet, somehow, overnight, nearly all our supplies had been systematinated. We started hiking again, hoping to reach the valley floor and find fresh water from the waterfalls. But the trail that had seemed so clear the day before now branched and forked in ways that made no sense. Our map showed a single path, but we kept encountering multiple options, each leading in different directions. "This is impossible," Jennifer said after we'd backtracked for the third time from what appeared to be a dead end. "Trails don't just change overnight." That's when I noticed the trees. The massive ohia that had served as landmarks the day before were gone, replaced by species I didn't recognize. Twisted, gnarled things with bark that looked almost like skin. Their branches formed shapes that hurt to look at directly, and I could have sworn I saw them moving even when there was no wind. "Jennifer, I think we need to turn back." She looked at me with relief flooding her features. "Thank God you said it first. I've been thinking the same thing for the last hour, but I didn't want to seem like a quitter." But when we tried to retrace our steps, we discovered that the trail behind us had changed as well. The path we'd taken down into the valley simply no longer existed. In its place was an impenetrable wall of vegetation, as if the forest had grown over it in a matter of hours. "This isn't possible," Jennifer kept repeating, her voice rising toward panic. "Things like this don't happen." I tried our cell phones, though I knew we'd had no signal since entering the valley. Both devices showed full battery but couldn't find any network. Worse, when I tried to access our photos from the previous day, the memory cards appeared to be completely empty. That afternoon, we found the first sign that we weren't alone in the valley. It was a campsite, or what had been one. A modern tent was collapsed and shredded, its bright orange fabric standing out garishly against the dark vegetation. Scattered around it were the remnants of expensive hiking gear, a titanium camp stove, a high-end water filter, pieces of a carbon fiber hiking pole. But everything was wrong. The metal components were corroded as if they'd been there for decades, and the fabric was bleached and rotted. "Someone else had trouble here," Jennifer said, stating the obvious. But as we examined the site more carefully, we found details that made no sense. The tent's rainfly was inside out, zipped from the inside, as if whoever had been sleeping in it had tried to keep something out, or in. Scattered around the perimeter were dozens of wooden stakes, driven into the ground in no pattern I could recognize, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the ruined campsite, we found a journal. The entries were dated from just 2 weeks earlier, written in a woman's careful handwriting. The first few pages described a hiking trip that sounded remarkably similar to ours, a couple from the mainland, excited about exploring the remote Waimanu Valley. But as the entries progressed, the handwriting became increasingly erratic. Day 3. Mark is acting strange. He went to collect firewood this morning and came back different. Won't talk, just stares at me with this smile that doesn't reach his eyes. I asked him about the camping spot we saw yesterday, the one with the weird rock formations, and he claimed he didn't remember it. But I know he does. I can see it in his eyes. Day 4. Not Mark anymore. Thing wearing Mark's face. It forgot our anniversary is next month. It forgot our dog's name. It keeps asking me questions about home, about our life, like it's trying to learn how to be him. The real Mark is allergic to shellfish. This thing ate the canned crab I brought without hesitation. Day 5. It's getting better at pretending. If I didn't know better, I might believe it was really him, but it never blinks. And sometimes when it thinks I'm not looking, its face slips. Underneath, there's something else, something hungry. The final entry was written in what looked like blood. It's coming for me now. If someone finds this, don't trust anyone you came with if they go missing, even for a few minutes. Don't let them back in your tent, and whatever you do, don't let them touch your skin. Jennifer dropped the journal as if it had burned her. "Will, we need to get out of here, right now." I wanted to agree, but where could we go? Every direction looked the same now. Twisted trees, thick mist, and paths that led nowhere. Our situation was becoming clear. We were lost in a place that didn't follow normal rules, with no supplies and no way to call for help. That's when Jennifer suggested something that made perfect sense and terrified me at the same time. What if we split up to look for a way out? We could cover twice as much ground, and if one of us finds something, we could come back for the other. Every survival instinct I had screamed against the idea, but we were desperate. We agreed to split up for exactly 1 hour, explore in opposite directions, and meet back at the ruined campsite. If either of us found a clear trail out, we'd return immediately to get the other. 1 hour, I said, checking my watch. 4:30 p.m. sharp, back here. Jennifer kissed me, a quick, nervous peck on the lips. "Be careful, Will. I love you." "Love you too. See you in an hour." I watched her disappear into the mist, her red jacket visible until the vapor swallowed her completely. Then I turned and headed in the opposite direction, pushing through vegetation that seemed to grab at my clothes and skin. For the first 30 minutes, I found nothing but more of the same twisted landscape. The trees grew stranger the deeper I went, their branches forming almost geometric patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. The mist thickened until I could barely see 5 feet ahead, and the silence was so complete that my own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Then I heard Jennifer calling my name. "Will! Will! Over here! I found something!" Her voice came from somewhere ahead and to my left, muffled by the mist, but unmistakably hers. I changed direction and pushed toward the sound, fighting through thick undergrowth that seemed determined to slow me down. "Jennifer, where are you? Over here, hurry!" I followed her voice for what felt like 10 minutes, but when I checked my watch, only 2 minutes had passed. Time felt wrong here, elastic, as if the valley existed in its own temporal bubble. Finally, I broke through a wall of ferns and found myself in another circular clearing. Jennifer stood in the center, her back to me, perfectly still. "Jen, you okay?" She turned around slowly and I saw her face clearly for the first time since we'd separated. She was smiling, but it was wrong. Too wide, lasting too long. Her eyes didn't blink. "I found the way out, Will," she said, her voice perfectly normal except for a subtle flatness, like someone reading lines from a script. "It's just through these trees. We can be back to the car in an hour." Every instinct screamed at me to run. But this was Jennifer. My Jennifer. The woman I'd planned to propose to under the Hawaiian stars. "That's great," I said carefully. "Show me." She gestured toward the tree line. But when I looked, there was no gap, no trail, nothing but the same impenetrable wall of vegetation we'd been facing all day. "Right there," she said, still smiling that horrible smile. "Can't you see it?" I looked at her more carefully. She was wearing the same clothes, had the same blonde ponytail, even had the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But something was fundamentally wrong. Her skin looked waxy, artificial, like a department store mannequin. And she wasn't breathing. "When's your birthday, Jen?" I asked quietly. "May 15th, she answered immediately. Wrong. Jennifer's birthday was July 22nd. "What's our dog's name?" "Chester." Wrong again. We didn't have a dog. The thing wearing Jennifer's face tilted its head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be human. "Why are you asking me these things, Will? Don't you trust me?" I backed away slowly, my hand moving to the knife on my belt. "Where's Jennifer? The real Jennifer?" The smile finally faded from its face, replaced by something hungry and ancient. "She's safe. She's part of us now. And soon you will be too." That's when I ran. I crashed through the underbrush blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The thing that had been wearing Jennifer's face calling my name behind me in a voice that grew less human with each repetition. The forest seemed to fight me with every step, roots catching my feet, low branches slapping at my face, the mist growing so thick I could barely see my own hands. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, then collapsed against a massive tree trunk, gasping for breath. Behind me, I could still hear it calling, but the voice was different now. Deeper, more guttural, speaking words in a language I didn't recognize. When I finally caught my breath and looked around, I realized I was back at the ruined campsite. But something had changed. The destroyed tent was gone, and in its place sat our tent, perfectly intact, with a warm light glowing from inside. "Will, is that you?" Jennifer's voice called from inside the tent. I was getting worried. I came back early because I found something incredible. I approached slowly, the knife still in my hand. "What did you find?" "Come see. I don't want to spoil the surprise." Through the tent's translucent wall, I could see her silhouette moving around inside. She appeared to be setting up something, maybe a surprise for my proposal. For a moment, hope flooded through me. Maybe the thing in the clearing hadn't been Jennifer at all. Maybe something in this cursed valley had the ability to create illusions, false copies meant to separate us. But as I reached for the tent zipper, I remembered the journal we'd found. "Don't let them back in your tent." "Jen, come out here. I want to tell you something." "Just come in, Will. Trust me." Trust. The same word the false Jennifer had used. "What's the name of your first pet?" I called through the tent wall. A long pause. Whiskers. Wrong again. Jennifer's first pet had been a goldfish named Goldie. We'd laughed about the unoriginal name on our second date. "Come out of the tent, Jennifer." "I can't, Will. I'm not decent. Just come in." I backed away from the tent, and as I did, the light inside began to change. What had appeared to be the warm glow of a camp lantern was now pulsing, shifting between colors that hurt to look at. The silhouette inside was changing too, growing taller, more angular, definitely not human. The voice that came from inside the tent was no longer trying to sound like Jennifer. "Come inside, William. Come home." I turned and ran again, this time with a destination in mind. The stream where we'd filled our water bottles the first day, it had to lead somewhere, probably down to the ocean. If I could follow it out of the valley, maybe I could find help, or at least escape whatever was hunting me. But finding the stream proved harder than expected. The landscape had changed again, and paths I was certain I'd traveled before led to places I'd never seen. The mist was so thick now that I had to feel my way forward, using tree trunks as guides, stopping frequently to listen for the sound of running water. That's when I heard Jennifer screaming. Not the false Jennifer, but the real one. I knew her voice, knew the particular pitch it reached when she was truly terrified. She was somewhere ahead of me, crying for help, begging someone to stop hurting her. Every rational thought told me it was a trap, but I couldn't abandon her. I pushed toward the sound, moving as quickly as I dared through the maze of twisted trees and grasping vegetation. The screaming led me to a depression in the forest floor, a natural bowl, perhaps 50 feet across. At the bottom, partially hidden by the mist, I could see movement. As I crept closer, the scene became clear, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. Jennifer was there, the real Jennifer, but she was not alone. Surrounding her were dozens of figures that might once have been human. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their limbs bent at impossible angles, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. They were doing something to her, something I couldn't quite see but that made her scream in agony. I started down the slope, knife in hand, ready to fight my way to her, but Jennifer's voice stopped me cold. "Will, don't! It's not what it looks like. They're not hurting me, they're changing me, making me better, making me like them." Her voice was calm now, conversational, even as the figures continued their work around her. "It doesn't hurt anymore, Will. It's actually wonderful. They're showing me things, teaching me secrets about this place, about what we can become. Jennifer, we need to leave, now." "I can't leave, Will. I don't want to leave. This is where I belong now, where we belong." One of the figures turned toward me, and in the shifting mist I caught a glimpse of its face. It was Mark, the man from the journal, but wrong in every conceivable way. His skin was the color of old leather, stretched too tight over bones that were the wrong shape. His eyes were black pits that seemed to go on forever, and when he smiled, I saw rows of teeth that looked more like splinters of bone than anything meant for eating. "Come down, William," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "Jennifer is waiting for you. We're all waiting for you." The other figures turned toward me then, and I realized with horror that I recognized some of them. Hikers who had gone missing in Hawaiian valleys over the years, their pictures familiar from news reports and missing person flyers. They were all here, all changed, all wrong. "The valley is hungry," the thing that had been Mark continued. "It feeds on visitors, on their life, their essence, their memories. But it doesn't waste anything. We become part of it, part of something larger and more beautiful than our small human lives ever were." Jennifer stood up then, and I could see what they had done to her. Her skin had the same waxy, artificial appearance as the others. Her movements were too fluid, as if her joints worked differently now, but her eyes were the worst part, completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Join us, Will," she said, and her voice was like wind through dead leaves. "Let the valley make you perfect." I ran then, harder and faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the forest with no thought for direction or destination. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not just Jennifer and the thing that had been Mark, but all of them, dozens of feet moving through the underbrush with that same wet, squelching sound I'd heard around our tent the first night. I ran until I broke free of the tree line and found myself on a rocky cliff overlooking the ocean. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that seemed impossibly beautiful after the oppressive gloom of the forest. Below me, waves crashed against black volcanic rocks, and I could see the lights of civilization far in the distance. But between me and safety was a 60-foot drop to jagged rocks and churning water. Behind me, the forest had gone quiet. I turned and saw them emerging from the mist, Jennifer and all the others, moving with predatory grace, their black eyes fixed on me with infinite patience. "There's nowhere left to run, William," Jennifer said. "Come home." I looked down at the rocks below, then back at the things that had once been people. The choice seemed clear: a quick death on the rocks, or whatever these creatures had planned for me. I was about to jump when I heard something that made me freeze. The distant sound of a helicopter. Search and rescue, probably looking for us after we'd failed to check in at our planned time. The sound was getting closer. The creatures heard it too. Their calm confidence wavered and they began moving toward me more urgently. "You can't escape what you are becoming," Jennifer said, but there was desperation in her voice now. "The valley has marked you. You'll never be free." The helicopter was definitely getting closer. I pulled out my emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the international distress signal. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I started climbing down the cliff face. The rock was volcanic basalt, rough and porous, offering plenty of handholds. I'd done some rock climbing in college, though nothing this high or dangerous, but fear gave me strength and focus, and I made steady progress downward while the helicopter sound grew louder. Above me, the creatures had reached the cliff edge. Jennifer was leaning over, watching my descent with those horrible black eyes. "You can't run forever, Will," she called down. "We know where you live. We know where your family lives. The valley remembers everything." But her voice was already fading, becoming less substantial, as if the approaching helicopter was somehow weakening whatever force held them together. I was perhaps 20 feet from the bottom when my foot slipped on a loose rock. I fell the last distance, landing hard on a narrow beach of black sand and sharp stones. Pain shot through my left ankle, but I could still move. I limped toward the water's edge, waving frantically at the sky. The helicopter spotted me almost immediately. Within minutes, I was being pulled up in a rescue basket, leaving the cursed valley behind forever. The official report stated that I'd suffered from severe dehydration and possible hallucinations brought on by eating toxic berries. Jennifer was listed as missing, presumed dead after falling from an unknown cliff. The search teams that went back into the valley found no trace of her, no sign of the ruined campsite, and no evidence that we'd ever been there at all. But I know the truth. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment back in Portland, I hear her voice on the wind, calling my name, promising that she's waiting for me to come home. The valley remembers, just like she said it would. I've moved 3 times since then, but the dreams follow me everywhere. Dreams of black sand beaches and twisted trees, of Jennifer's voice calling to me from the mist, of the day I'll finally stop running and return to that hungry place in the Hawaiian mountains. Because she was right about one thing: you can't escape what you're becoming. And every night, a little more of me disappears, replaced by something that belongs to the valley, something that wants to go home. The engagement ring is still in my desk drawer, never given, never returned. Sometimes I hold it and remember the woman I loved, before the valley took her and replaced her with something wearing her face. But mostly, I try not to think about Hawaii at all, because thinking about it makes me want to go back.